Some places swallow sound the way others swallow light. Mirror Lake sits at 10,020 feet above sea level in the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, a glacial remnant carved from granite and time. The lake stretches roughly 800 yards at its widest point, fed by snowmelt from the surrounding peaks and drained by a modest creek that winds northeast toward the Weber River. For most visitors, it represents the kind of pristine alpine destination that Utah's high country promises: clear water, reflecting pine and sky, accessible by a well-maintained trail that attracts families and day hikers throughout the summer months. The area has been documented since the 1870s, when geological surveys first mapped the Uinta Mountains for mineral potential. Early reports described the lake as unremarkable, except for its clarity and the populations of brook trout that thrived in its cold waters. Indigenous groups, primarily Ute bands, had traveled through the region for centuries, though their oral histories contain few specific references to the lake itself. What references exist suggest the area was used primarily as a waypoint during seasonal migrations rather than a destination. By the 1950s, Mirror Lake had become a popular camping spot, accessible by the newly completed Mirror Lake Highway. The Utah Division of Parks established basic facilities: fire rings, pit toilets, designated camping areas, and began keeping visitor logs. These logs, maintained continuously from 1952 through the present day, show steady but unremarkable usage patterns. Families from Salt Lake City, Provo, and smaller Utah towns made up the majority of visitors, with peak usage occurring during July and August, when snow had cleared from the higher elevations. The first documented incident occurred on July 14, 1987. The Henriksen family from Ogden had arrived at Mirror Lake for a week-long camping trip, setting up their site approximately 60 yards from the lake's eastern shore. David Henriksen, a high school science teacher, had brought along a portable radio and a cassette recorder, planning to document bird calls for a summer class project. According to his written account, filed with the Forest Service on July 21st, the equipment functioned normally until the morning of July 15th. Henriksen described attempting to record what he believed were unusual bird vocalizations coming from the eastern shore area. When he played back the recording, however, the tape contained only silence. Not static, not ambient forest noise, but complete absence of sound. He tested the equipment on other areas around their campsite and found it working perfectly. Only when positioned within what he estimated to be 50 feet of the eastern shoreline did the devices fail to capture any audio whatsoever. "I thought maybe it was interference from the altitude or the granite formations," Henriksen wrote in his report. "But when I had my wife call out to me from that area while I recorded from our campsite, her voice came through clearly until she walked closer to the water. Then, nothing. Like someone had pressed a mute button on that specific piece of ground." The Hendersons encountered the phenomenon 3 days later. Robert and Linda Henderson, both amateur photographers from Park City, had hiked to Mirror Lake specifically to capture sunrise shots over the water. Linda Henderson carried a small tape recorder to document their observations for a photography club presentation. Her account, also filed with the Forest Service, corroborates the Henriksens' experience in unsettling detail. "We set up our equipment about 40 feet from the shoreline on the eastern side because the light was perfect," Linda Henderson stated. "I started my commentary for the recording, describing the lighting conditions and camera settings. When we played it back at our hotel that evening, my voice simply stopped mid-sentence when I moved closer to the water. The tape kept running, but there was no sound at all for the 15 minutes we spent right at the shore." Robert Henderson added his own observations about the wildlife in the area. "We're experienced hikers, and we know what mountain lakes should sound like. There should be insects, small animals moving through the brush, wind through the trees. But that section of shoreline was completely silent, not just on our recording equipment, but to our ears. Even our footsteps seemed muffled when we walked there." The third family, the Carlsons from Salt Lake City, reported their experience on July 23rd. Mark Carlson, an electrician, had brought a battery-powered radio to listen to baseball games during their camping trip. According to his written statement, the radio produced clear reception throughout their campsite, except when carried to the eastern shore of the lake. The radio didn't malfunction, Carlson explained. The stations were still tuned in. The display showed strong signal strength, but no sound came out of the speakers. As soon as I walked back toward our tent, the audio returned. I tested it 6 or 7 times, and it happened every time. My kids thought I was playing some kind of trick on them. Forest Service records show that Ranger Patricia Moss investigated the reports in early August 1987. Moss, a 12-year veteran with the service, brought a variety of audio equipment to test the phenomenon herself. Her initial report, dated August 9th, confirmed the basic elements of the civilian accounts. Recording devices placed within approximately 50 feet of the eastern shoreline failed to capture ambient sound, though they registered normal function when tested elsewhere around the lake. "I've never encountered anything like this in my career," Moss wrote. "The equipment works perfectly until you cross an invisible line near the shore. Then, complete audio failure. Visual inspection of the area reveals nothing unusual. No geological anomalies, no signs of electromagnetic interference, no obvious explanation for the phenomenon." Moss requested permission to conduct a more thorough investigation, including bringing in specialists from the University of Utah's geology and physics departments. Her request was initially approved, and arrangements were made for a research team to visit Mirror Lake in September 1987. However, according to internal Forest Service memos obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests years later, the investigation was quietly canceled without explanation on August 28th. The memo canceling the investigation, signed by Regional Supervisor James Walsh, cited budget constraints and competing priorities as the reason for the decision. Walsh, who retired from the Forest Service in 1992, declined to be interviewed about the Mirror Lake incidents when contacted by researchers in 2003. His successor, Karen Thompson, stated that she had no knowledge of any unusual phenomena at Mirror Lake and that all reports of such incidents had been resolved through normal channels. Dr. Michael Santos, a geophysicist at the University of Utah, who had been scheduled to participate in the canceled investigation, maintained interest in the case for several years. In 1990, he attempted to visit Mirror Lake independently to conduct his own tests. According to his personal notes, he was unable to reproduce the phenomenon described in the original reports. However, Santos noted that his visit occurred in October after the area had received its first significant snowfall, and that snow cover made it difficult to identify the exact locations described by the witnesses. The acoustic properties of snow would have made any meaningful testing impossible, Santos noted. "I plan to return the following summer, but other projects took priority." Santos died in a climbing accident in 1994, and his research files were donated to the university library, where they remain accessible to researchers. The original witness reports present several consistent elements that resist easy explanation. All 3 families describe the same approximate boundary for the phenomenon roughly 50 feet from the eastern shoreline. All reported complete absence of recorded sound rather than distortion or interference. Most significantly, all noted that the silence affected not just their equipment, but their direct auditory experience of the area. Forest Service visitor logs from the summers following 1987 show no additional reports of unusual phenomena at Mirror Lake. However, a pattern emerges in the camping permit data that may be significant. Requests for campsites on the eastern side of the lake, which had been consistently popular in previous years, dropped sharply after 1987 and remained low through the 1990s. Site preference data suggests that visitors increasingly chose western and northern shore locations, though no official explanation for this shift appears in Park Service records. The 3 families who filed the original reports all attempted to follow up on their experiences in subsequent years. David Henriksen wrote to the Forest Service annually from 1988 through 1992, requesting updates on any investigation or explanation for the phenomenon. His letters, preserved in the service's files, received identical form responses stating that his concerns had been noted and will be addressed through appropriate channels. Linda Henderson contacted local news outlets in 1989, hoping to generate public interest in the mystery. A reporter from the Salt Lake Tribune visited Mirror Lake but found no evidence of the acoustic anomaly. The resulting article, published on September 12, 1989, treated the reports as an interesting but unverified local legend. Henderson later stated that the reporter's visit occurred in late September, when early snow may have affected conditions at the lake. Today, Mirror Lake continues to attract thousands of visitors each summer. The eastern shore remains accessible by trail, and campsites in that area are bookable through the standard reservation system. Park Service materials make no mention of any unusual phenomena, and current rangers report no knowledge of the 1987 incidents. The original witness reports remain in Forest Service files, classified as resolved, with no additional notation explaining the resolution. The silence that 3 families documented that summer exists now only in their written accounts and in the questions those accounts raise. Whether the phenomenon was temporary, seasonal, or continues to affect that precise coordinate above Mirror Lake remains unknown. What is certain is that something occurred there that summer, something specific enough to affect multiple recording devices in identical ways, yet subtle enough to be forgotten by all official channels within a few years of its documentation. Sometimes maps remember places that never were. Green River sits in central Utah, where the Colorado Plateau meets the high desert, a town of roughly 1,000 residents, straddling the banks of the Green River as it carves its way south toward the Colorado River confluence. The settlement began as a railroad stop in 1883, serving the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad's push through the region's challenging terrain. By the 1920s, Green River had established itself as a service center for ranchers and railroad workers, with a main street running parallel to the tracks and residential areas spreading outward in the predictable grid pattern of western towns. The town's layout was first officially surveyed in 1907 by territorial engineers preparing maps for Utah's statehood documentation. These early surveys show a simple arrangement: Main Street running east-west alongside the railroad, with numbered cross streets extending north and south. The survey was updated in 1923 to reflect new construction and again in 1941 as part of a statewide mapping initiative. All these documents show a consistent, unremarkable street layout that matched the physical reality of the growing town. The Utah Department of Transportation began comprehensive remapping of municipal areas in 1951, part of a federal highway planning initiative that required detailed local maps for emergency services and postal delivery. Green River was surveyed that winter by a team led by cartographer William Hayes, whose work would be incorporated into official state maps beginning in 1952. Hayes, a veteran surveyor who had mapped dozens of Utah communities, submitted his final Green River survey in March 1952, with no indication that anything unusual had occurred during the mapping process. The anomaly first appeared in the 1952 edition of the Utah Department of Transportation's Municipal Map Series. Larson Avenue was shown running north-south between 3rd Street and 4th Street, extending from the railroad tracks south to the town's edge near the river bluffs. The street appeared complete with standard cartographic symbols, house number markers indicating residential lots, utility line notations showing water and electrical service, and even small squares representing individual structures. According to the map, Larson Avenue contained 14 residential addresses, numbered consecutively from 100 to 127. The map's publication and distribution followed normal procedures. Copies were sent to the Green River Post Office, the county courthouse, utility companies, and emergency services. For nearly a decade, every official map of Green River included Larson Avenue as a standard feature of the town's geography. The street appeared in phone directories, postal service routing guides, and county property records. Insurance companies issued policies for Larson Avenue addresses, and the Internal Revenue Service processed tax returns listing those locations. Local residents first noticed the discrepancy in 1953 when postal worker Mary Hendricks mentioned to friends that she regularly delivered mail to Larson Avenue addresses, despite having no clear memory of the street itself. Hendricks, who had worked for the Green River Post Office since 1946, initially assumed she was experiencing some form of memory lapse related to the town's recent growth. "I knew every street in Green River by heart," Hendricks later explained to a Salt Lake Tribune reporter in 1962. "But I kept getting mail for Larson Avenue, and somehow I always knew where to deliver it. The letters would go to the right people, but they lived on other streets entirely. I delivered mail to Mrs. Patterson on Larson Avenue, but Mrs. Patterson lived on 3rd Street. The mail found its way to her house anyway." Hendricks' experience was shared by several utility workers and delivery drivers who served Green River during the 1950s. Electric company lineman Robert Chen reported receiving multiple work orders for service calls on Larson Avenue between 1954 and 1958. Chen's work logs, preserved in the utility company's archives, show completed service calls for 14 different Larson Avenue addresses, all marked as successfully resolved. "The addresses were always accurate," Chen told the Tribune. "The work orders would say Larson Avenue, and I'd go to the location and find the problem exactly where the paperwork said it would be. But I was never actually working on Larson Avenue because there wasn't one. I was on 3rd Street or 4th Street, or sometimes down by the railroad. The addresses somehow translated to the right locations." County Tax Assessor James Morrison discovered the mapping inconsistency in 1959 while preparing property valuations for the upcoming assessment cycle. Morrison found 14 property records listing Larson Avenue addresses, complete with lot descriptions, improvement valuations, and ownership histories dating back to 1952. However, his physical inspection of the town revealed no corresponding street or properties. "The paperwork was all in order," Morrison explained in a 1960 county commission meeting. "Legal descriptions, deed transfers, tax payment histories, everything you'd expect for normal residential properties. But when I tried to locate the actual lots for assessment purposes, I found empty space between 3rd and 4th Streets, just vacant land that nobody had ever built on." Morrison's investigation revealed that property taxes had been collected on the Larson Avenue addresses for 7 years, with payments consistently made by the same individuals who owned properties on adjacent streets. When contacted, these property owners expressed confusion about the duplicate tax bills but confirmed they had been paying them regularly to avoid penalties. Most assumed the bills represented some form of municipal fee or special assessment they didn't understand. The discrepancy came to wider attention in 1960, when new resident Donald Price attempted to purchase a home at 115 Larson Avenue, responding to a real estate listing in the Salt Lake City newspaper. Price arrived in Green River with a cashier's check and property deed documentation, only to discover that the address existed solely on paper. The real estate agent who had listed the property, Helen Morrison of Morrison Realty, produced maps and utility records confirming the street's existence, but could not locate the physical property. Mr. Price was understandably upset, Helen Morrison told the Tribune. The listing was based on official county maps and utility company records. As far as the paperwork was concerned, 115 Larson Avenue was a perfectly normal 2-bedroom house with city water and electrical service. I had no reason to doubt the documentation. The incident prompted the first official investigation into the Larson Avenue anomaly. County Surveyor Thomas Webb was assigned to reconcile the mapping discrepancy in September 1960. Webb's survey team spent 3 weeks in Green River, using both modern instruments and historical records to determine the town's actual street layout. Their final report, submitted in October 1960, confirmed that no street corresponding to Larson Avenue had ever existed in Green River. Webb's investigation revealed that the original 1952 survey data contained no reference to Larson Avenue. The cartographer's field notes, equipment readings, and preliminary sketches all showed the standard grid pattern of numbered cross streets. Larson Avenue appeared only in the final map produced from this data, suggesting the addition occurred during the map's preparation rather than during the field survey process. The surveying was accurate, Webb wrote in his report. Mr. Hayes' field measurements and documentation were completely standard and showed no anomalies. The street appears to have been added to the map during the drafting process, but we found no evidence of intentional alteration or error in the Cartographic Department's procedures. The Utah Department of Transportation responded to Webb's findings by removing Larson Avenue from all future maps, beginning with the 1962 edition. However, the department's explanation for the street's 9-year presence in official documents proved unsatisfactory to many observers. Department spokesperson Carol Williams characterized the incident as a clerical error in the map production process and stated that such errors, while unusual, were not unprecedented in large-scale mapping projects. Maps are complex documents produced by multiple departments and individuals, Williams explained to reporters in 1962. While we maintain strict quality control procedures, occasionally anomalies can occur during the production process. The important thing is that we identified and corrected the error promptly once it was brought to our attention. However, Williams' explanation did not address several aspects of the phenomenon that remained unexplained. Mail delivery to Larson Avenue addresses had functioned consistently for nearly a decade, with postal workers successfully routing correspondence to appropriate recipients despite the street's non-existence. Utility companies had completed service calls and maintenance work at the fictitious addresses without apparent difficulty. Most significantly, property taxes had been assessed and collected on properties that existed only in county records. The removal of Larson Avenue from official maps in 1962 did not immediately resolve all administrative complications related to the Phantom Street. Insurance policies, voter registrations, and various government records continued to reference Larson Avenue addresses for several years. The Green River Post Office reported receiving occasional mail addressed to the non-existent street as late as 1968, though postal workers by then had been instructed to return such mail as undeliverable. Several residents who had paid property taxes on Larson Avenue addresses for multiple years requested refunds from the county treasurer's office. However, county officials determined that the tax payments had been properly processed according to existing records and that refunds would require specific legislative authorization. As of 1965, no such authorization had been granted, and the tax payments remained on the books as legitimate county revenue. The Larson Avenue incident attracted brief attention from researchers studying cartographic anomalies, but academic interest waned when no similar cases were identified in other Utah communities. Dr. Margaret Foster, a geography professor at the University of Utah who examined the case in 1964, concluded that the phenomenon represented an isolated administrative error rather than evidence of systematic problems in the state's mapping procedures. While the persistence and consistency of the error are unusual, Foster wrote in her 1965 paper for the Journal of Applied Geography, the most likely explanation remains human error during the map production process. The fact that supporting documentation was generated for the fictitious street suggests that once the error was introduced, normal bureaucratic procedures perpetuated it across multiple agencies and time periods. Today, Green River's street layout follows the same grid pattern documented in territorial surveys more than a century ago. 3rd Street and 4th Street run parallel from the railroad tracks to the river bluffs, with no street between them. County maps show vacant land in the area where Larson Avenue once appeared, though property records from the 1950s remain in the courthouse archives, documenting 9 years of tax payments and municipal services for addresses that never existed. The 14 families who received mail at Larson Avenue addresses during those years have mostly moved away or passed on. Those few who remain in Green River recall the experience with a mixture of confusion and resignation, as though they participated in some elaborate municipal misunderstanding that everyone preferred to forget. None can explain how mail addressed to the Phantom Street consistently reached its intended recipients, or why they continued paying property taxes on lots that existed only in the careful geometry of official maps. Climate obeys no boundaries except the ones it creates for itself. Antelope Island rises from the Great Salt Lake, like a forgotten mountain range, 15 miles long and 4 miles wide at its broadest point. The island sits roughly 30 miles northwest of Salt Lake City, connected to the mainland by a 7-mile causeway completed in 1969. Before the causeway, Antelope Island remained largely isolated, accessible only by boat when lake levels permitted safe passage. The Shoshone and Ute peoples visited seasonally to hunt the pronghorn antelope that gave the island its name, but few permanent settlements existed on the windswept terrain. The island's ecology reflects its unique position in one of North America's largest inland water bodies. Grasslands dominate the lower elevations, giving way to scrub oak and juniper on the higher ridges. The Great Salt Lake's influence creates a modified desert climate with cooler temperatures and higher humidity than the surrounding region. Prevailing winds from the northwest carry moisture from the lake's surface, creating microclimates that vary significantly across the island's relatively small area. Utah established Antelope Island State Park in 1969. The same year, the causeway opened the island to regular vehicle access. The Park Service constructed visitor facilities, hiking trails, and camping areas to accommodate the expected increase in tourism. Initial development focused on the island's southern end, where gentle slopes and established vegetation provided the most suitable sites for recreational infrastructure. Park rangers documented the island's flora and fauna systematically for the first time, creating baseline data for future conservation efforts. The temperature anomaly was first recorded on June 18, 1974, during routine weather observations conducted by Park Ranger David Kellerman. Kellerman had been assigned to establish a comprehensive climate monitoring program for the park, installing thermometers and barometric instruments at various locations across the island. His assignment included creating detailed topographic maps that correlated elevation, vegetation, and local weather patterns. On that June morning, Kellerman was conducting measurements along the island's central ridge when he noticed an abrupt temperature change that seemed unrelated to elevation or wind patterns. According to his field notes, the air temperature dropped from 81 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees within the span of approximately 10 feet. Kellerman initially attributed the change to a localized wind effect or measurement error, but subsequent readings confirmed the temperature differential. "I thought my thermometer was malfunctioning," Kellerman wrote in his June 19th report to park headquarters. "But I tested it in other locations and found it reading accurately." The temperature change occurs along what appears to be a perfectly straight line, running northeast to southwest across the ridge. On one side, normal summer temperatures. Step across the line, and it's 11 degrees cooler. Kellerman spent the following week mapping the temperature line with increasing precision. His measurements revealed that the phenomenon extended across the entire island, from the northwestern shore to the southeastern tip, maintaining a consistent northeast-southwest orientation. The temperature differential remained exactly 11 degrees regardless of the time of day, weather conditions, or seasonal changes. Most significantly, the line appeared to be perfectly straight, showing no deviation for topographic features, vegetation changes, or other environmental factors. Park Superintendent Margaret Chen reviewed Kellerman's findings and authorized additional testing using more sophisticated equipment. In July 1974, the Park Service installed a series of digital thermometers along the temperature line, recording readings every 15 minutes around the clock. The data confirmed Kellerman's observations with remarkable consistency. Temperatures on the southeast side of the line averaged 11 degrees higher than temperatures on the northwest side. The readings were so consistent, they seemed artificial, Chen noted in her quarterly report to the Utah Division of Parks and Recreation. Digital equipment, analog instruments, handheld thermometers, all showed the same differential. 11 degrees, measured at any point along the line, at any time of day or night, in any weather conditions we experienced that summer. the Park Service expanded the monitoring program in 1975, installing weather stations on both sides of the temperature line to collect comprehensive meteorological data. Ranger Susan Walsh, who supervised the expanded program, documented additional anomalies that accompanied the temperature differential. Humidity readings showed corresponding changes, with the cooler northwest side consistently registering higher moisture content. Wind patterns also differed across the line, though the variations were subtle and required sensitive instruments to detect. Wildlife behavior was the most noticeable indicator, Walsh observed in her 1976 annual report. Deer, pronghorn, even small mammals showed clear preferences for one side of the line or the other, depending on the season. During summer, animals congregated on the cooler northwest side. In winter, they moved southeast to the warmer zone. It was as if they understood the boundary better than we did. Local meteorologist Dr. Richard Santos from the University of Utah visited Antelope Island in August 1975 to investigate the phenomenon independently. Santos brought portable weather monitoring equipment and conducted measurements at 20-point intervals along the temperature line. His findings, published in the October 1975 issue of the Utah Weather Review, confirmed the Park Service data while raising additional questions about the phenomenon's underlying cause. The temperature differential is consistent and measurable, Santos wrote. However, it defies conventional meteorological explanation. Topographic influences, lake effects, and seasonal variations all fail to account for the precise nature of the boundary. The line appears to represent a fundamental atmospheric division that exists independent of observable environmental factors. Santos recommended that the National Weather Service conduct a comprehensive study of the Antelope Island anomaly, citing its potential significance for understanding regional climate patterns. His recommendation was forwarded to the Weather Service's regional office in Salt Lake City in September 1975. According to correspondence obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, the Weather Service acknowledged Santos's recommendation and indicated that a research team would be assigned to investigate the phenomenon during the 1976 field season. However, no National Weather Service investigation materialized. Internal memos from 1976 suggest that the proposed study was postponed due to budget constraints and competing research priorities. By 1977, references to the Antelope Island temperature anomaly had disappeared entirely from Weather Service planning documents. Santos continued to advocate for official investigation until his retirement in 1983, but his requests received increasingly perfunctory responses from federal agencies. Park rangers continued documenting the temperature line throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Their monthly reports consistently noted the 11-degree differential and its effects on local weather patterns and wildlife behavior. However, equipment failures began occurring with troubling regularity starting in 1976. Digital thermometers installed along the line would function normally for approximately 18 months before suddenly malfunctioning or producing erratic readings. We replaced the monitoring equipment 4 times between 1976 and 1980, recalled Ranger Thomas Burke, who worked at Antelope Island from 1975 to 1982. Each time, the instruments would work perfectly for about a year and a half, then start giving impossible readings or stop working entirely. We tested the equipment before installation and after failure. It worked fine until we put it on the temperature line. The equipment failures followed a consistent pattern that frustrated park maintenance crews. Instruments positioned more than 50 feet from the temperature line operated normally for years without significant problems. Equipment placed directly on the line or within 20 feet of it invariably failed after approximately 18 months. Replacement instruments would function normally for the same period before experiencing identical failures. It wasn't weather damage or vandalism, Burke explained. The equipment looked fine externally. It just stopped recording accurate temperatures along that specific line. We'd moved the same instruments to other locations on the island, and they'd work perfectly. Put them back on the temperature line, and they'd fail again within a few months. By 1983, the Park Service had discontinued its formal monitoring program for the temperature anomaly. Budget constraints and equipment replacement costs were cited as primary factors in the decision, though internal correspondence suggests that administrators were also frustrated by the lack of outside scientific interest in the phenomenon. The final equipment monitoring report, submitted in March 1983, noted that the temperature differential remained consistent despite the cessation of systematic documentation. Recent visitors to Antelope Island can still observe the temperature line, though it receives no mention in official park materials or interpretive programs. Hikers with handheld thermometers occasionally rediscover the phenomenon and report their findings to park rangers, who acknowledge the observations but provide no official explanation. The line's location has remained constant over 5 decades, running from the island's northwestern shore near Elephant Head to its southeastern tip near Bridger Bay. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a climatologist at Utah State University, conducted informal measurements along the temperature line in 2018 as part of a broader study of Great Salt Lake weather patterns. Her data confirmed that the 11-degree differential persists, though she noted that changing lake levels and climate patterns have affected the island's overall temperature profile. The fundamental anomaly remains intact, Morrison stated in a 2019 interview. Modern equipment still registers the same temperature differential that rangers documented in the 1970s. What's changed is our institutional memory of the phenomenon. It's become an unofficial curiosity rather than a documented scientific question. Park records from the past 2 decades contain occasional references to visitor inquiries about temperature variations on the island, but no systematic investigation has been conducted since the early 1980s. Rangers report that weather-sensitive visitors sometimes comment on the noticeable temperature change while hiking the island's central trails, but most attribute the sensation to elevation changes or wind patterns. The temperature line continues its quiet division of Antelope Island's climate, as precise and inexplicable as when David Kellerman first documented it 50 years ago. Wildlife still congregates on the seasonally appropriate side of the boundary, and careful observers with thermometers can still confirm the 11-degree differential that defied explanation for decades before disappearing into administrative indifference. The line exists as a permanent reminder that even the most measurable mysteries can be filed away and forgotten, reduced to an unmarked boundary that divides the island's air into 2 distinct climates with no official acknowledgement of the division's impossible precision. Time, it seems, can forget to move forward. Moab sits in southeastern Utah, where the Colorado River carves through red sandstone canyons, a town of 3,000 residents serving as gateway to Arches and Canyonlands National Parks. The settlement began in the 1870s as a Mormon farming community, taking advantage of the river's water and the valley's fertile soil. By the 1950s, uranium mining had transformed Moab into a boom town, with prospectors and mining companies drawn by the region's rich ore deposits hidden in the surrounding rock formations. The town's isolation has always defined its character. Moab lies more than 50 miles from the nearest city of comparable size, surrounded by desert wilderness that stretches to the horizon in every direction. Radio communication with the outside world requires careful attention to atmospheric conditions, and telephone service remained unreliable until the late 1960s. Residents developed a self-reliant mindset, born of geographic necessity, learning to depend on local resources and each other rather than outside assistance during emergencies or unusual circumstances. The Colorado River provides Moab's primary connection to the broader world, carrying rafters and supplies downstream toward Lake Powell and the Grand Canyon. Upstream, the river winds through Colorado's mountain valleys, linking Moab to the agricultural communities and energy projects that define the region's economy. The town serves as a crucial supply point for river expeditions and a last stop for travelers heading into the remote canyon country that surrounds the valley on 3 sides. The incident began at exactly 3:17 a.m. on March 15, 1983, when every mechanical and electronic timepiece in Moab simultaneously stopped functioning. Electric clocks froze with their digital displays showing 3:17. Wind-up alarm clocks ceased ticking mid-second. Wristwatches stopped moving regardless of their power source or mechanical design. Even the town's official clock tower, maintained by the City Public Works Department, stood motionless with its hands pointing to 3:17. Police dispatcher Janet Morrison was working the overnight shift at the Moab Police Department when the phenomenon began. Morrison's incident log, preserved in the department's archives, provides the most detailed contemporary account of the event's initial stages. According to her notes, the police station's multiple clocks stopped simultaneously, followed immediately by reports from citizens who had noticed the same occurrence in their homes and businesses. "I thought we'd lost power," Morrison wrote in her incident report. But the lights were working, the radio was functioning, everything seemed normal except that time had stopped. "I called the power company, and their dispatcher said the same thing was happening to their equipment. Every clock in town showed 3:17, and none of them were moving." Morrison's log entries for the following hours document a growing sense of unease among Moab residents as they discovered the scope of the temporal anomaly. Citizens called the police station to report that their timepieces had stopped, but they also began describing more disturbing observations. The sun, which should have risen gradually over the eastern canyon walls, remained fixed in its pre-dawn position. Stars visible in the clear desert sky showed no apparent movement across the heavens. Local radio station KCYN continued broadcasting throughout the event, though disc jockey Robert Chen reported experiencing what he described as the longest night shift in radio history. Chen's broadcast logs show continuous programming for what felt like a complete 24-hour period, yet astronomical observations suggested that no actual time elapsed during the station's extended broadcast cycle. "I played my entire music library twice," Chen later told investigators. "I gave weather reports, read community announcements, took phone calls from listeners. It felt like a normal day's worth of broadcasting, but the sun never came up. I kept looking out the studio window, expecting to see dawn, but it stayed dark. The strangest part was that I never got tired, never felt hungry, never needed to use the bathroom, like my body had stopped keeping time along with the clocks." The experience varied among Moab's residents, though common elements emerged in subsequent interviews. Most reported feeling fully awake and alert throughout the extended period, despite the apparent absence of dawn. Normal physiological rhythms seemed suspended along with mechanical time. Children attended to their usual activities without becoming tired. Adults completed household tasks and daily routines without feeling the passage of hours. Sarah Henderson, a nurse at the Moab Regional Medical Center, documented her experience in a detailed diary entry written immediately after the incident. Henderson was working the night shift when the clocks stopped and found herself caring for patients through what felt like an impossibly long period without any change in their conditions or needs. "Mrs. Patterson in room 12 was scheduled for morning medication at 6 a.m., Henderson wrote. "I kept checking on her throughout the night, waiting for 6 o'clock to arrive, but it never did. She never asked for water, never complained about pain, never seemed to notice that morning wasn't coming. The whole ward was eerily quiet, not in a bad way, just suspended somehow." Henderson's medical log shows continuous patient observations, spanning what she experienced as 18 hours. Yet the entries are all time-stamped at 3:17 a.m. Hospital equipment continued functioning normally, with life support systems, monitors, and other devices operating without interruption. However, no automatic time-stamped records advanced beyond 3:17 on March 15th. The phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun. At precisely 3:18 a.m., according to witness accounts, every stopped timepiece in Moab resumed normal operation. Clocks began ticking, digital displays advanced to 3:18, and the town's temporal isolation ended after what residents had experienced as a full day and night cycle. The sun's position in the sky remained consistent with 3:18 a.m. on March 15th, as though no time had actually elapsed. Federal investigators arrived in Moab within 6 hours of the clock's resumption, traveling by chartered aircraft from Salt Lake City. The investigation team was led by Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who specialized in precision timekeeping and atomic clock research. Webb's team included specialists from the Federal Communications Commission, the Department of Energy, and an unnamed agency that local officials were instructed not to identify in their reports. Webb established his headquarters at the Moab City Hall and began conducting systematic interviews with residents who had experienced the temporal anomaly. His team collected timepieces from throughout the town, testing them for radiation exposure, magnetic field effects, and other potential causes of simultaneous malfunction. They also installed sophisticated monitoring equipment at various locations around Moab, apparently in anticipation of a recurrence of the phenomenon. Dr. Webb was very thorough and very secretive, recalled Mayor Dennis Patterson, who served as the federal team's primary local contact. He interviewed dozens of people, collected hundreds of clocks and watches, took readings with equipment I'd never seen before. But he never told us what he was looking for or what he thought might have caused the incident. The investigation continued for 11 days, during which Webb's team maintained strict control over information about their activities. Local newspaper publisher Karen Morrison was instructed not to report on the federal presence in Moab, and radio station KCYN was asked to avoid mentioning the investigation in their local news broadcasts. Residents were told that the investigation was classified for national security reasons, though no explanation was provided for why a timing anomaly in a small Utah town would constitute a security concern. Webb's preliminary findings, according to leaked portions of his initial report, confirmed that the temporal anomaly had affected every mechanical and electronic timepiece in Moab simultaneously. His team found no evidence of electromagnetic interference, radiation exposure, or other external factors that might explain the synchronized malfunction. Most significantly, astronomical data confirmed that the Earth's rotation had proceeded normally throughout March 15th, despite the subjective experience of Moab residents. The discrepancy between subjective time and astronomical time presents the most significant aspect of this incident, Webb wrote in his preliminary report. Residents experienced approximately 24 hours of subjective time, while astronomical measurements indicate that only 1 minute of actual time elapsed. This suggests a localized temporal distortion that affected human perception without altering the fundamental passage of time in the region. However, Webb's investigation was terminated abruptly on March 26th, 11 days after its commencement. Federal personnel removed their monitoring equipment and departed Moab without providing final conclusions or recommendations to local authorities. Webb himself was reassigned to a different project within the National Institute of Standards and Technology and declined all subsequent requests for interviews about the Moab investigation. The official incident report, classified immediately upon completion, has never been released despite multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. A heavily redacted summary released in 1997 confirmed that a temporal measurement anomaly had occurred in Moab on March 15, 1983, but provided no details about the investigation's findings or conclusions. Webb retired from federal service in 1987 and died in 1994 without ever speaking publicly about his work in Moab. Local authorities received no follow-up communication from federal agencies regarding the March 15th incident. The monitoring equipment installed by Webb's team was removed completely, leaving no trace of the investigation except in the memories of Moab residents who had been interviewed. City records contain only brief references to federal assistance with equipment malfunction investigation in March 1983. The phenomenon has never recurred in Moab, and no similar incidents have been reported in other communities. Residents who experienced the missing day continue to live and work in the town, though few discuss the incident openly. Those willing to speak about March 15th maintain that their memories of the extended time frame remain vivid and consistent, despite the apparent impossibility of their shared experience. Today, Moab functions as a normal small city, with reliable timekeeping and standard temporal rhythms. Visitors find nothing unusual about the town's relationship with time, and most residents have integrated the memory of the missing day into their understanding of local history, rather than viewing it as an ongoing mystery. Yet somewhere in federal archives, Dr. Webb's classified report documents 18 hours that officially never happened, preserved as evidence of the day when time forgot to move forward in a small Utah town surrounded by ancient sandstone and endless desert sky. Sound has a memory, but sometimes it remembers things that never happened. Goblin Valley State Park sprawls across 3,640 acres of the San Rafael Desert in central Utah, a landscape shaped by 50 million years of erosion into mushroom-shaped rock formations called hoodoos. The Entrada sandstone that forms these structures was deposited during the Jurassic period, when the region lay beneath a vast inland sea. Wind and water carved the stone into thousands of individual formations, creating a maze of narrow canyons, hidden alcoves, and towering spires that early settlers compared to a gathering of goblins frozen in stone. The area remained largely unexplored by European settlers until the 1920s, when cowboy Arthur Chafin stumbled upon the valley while searching for cattle. Chafin described the formations as a world that people were never meant to see, noting the unusual acoustics that seemed to carry whispered conversations for impossible distances while muffling shouted words. The state of Utah acquired the land in 1964, establishing the park to preserve the unique geological features and provide controlled access to researchers and tourists. Native American groups, primarily Fremont and later Ute peoples, left petroglyphs throughout the valley, but few oral traditions specific to the hoodoo formations. Archaeological evidence suggests the area was used primarily for hunting and seasonal camping rather than permanent settlement. The petroglyphs, dating from approximately 900 to 1300 AD, depict hunting scenes and geometric patterns, but include several panels that show human figures with what appear to be multiple mouths or voices, represented by wavy lines emanating from their heads. The first documented report of acoustic anomalies came from park visitor Janet Morrison in July 1976. Morrison, an elementary school teacher from Price, Utah, had brought her family to explore the park's hiking trails during summer vacation. According to her written complaint filed with the Park Service, she experienced disturbing echo effects while calling to her children in the northwestern section of the valley, an area known informally as the Goblin Garden, due to its concentration of particularly tall and narrow formations. I called out, "Come back here," to my son Tommy, who had wandered into the hoodoos. Morrison wrote in her complaint letter dated July 23, 1976. But what came back to me was, "Come back where?" Not an echo of what I said, but different words entirely. I thought I was hearing things, so I tried again. This time I shouted, "Tommy, stay close." The echo that came back said, "Tommy, stay lost." My husband heard it too. We got the children and left immediately. Morrison's account was initially dismissed by park officials as a misunderstanding caused by the valley's complex acoustic properties. However, similar reports began accumulating in the park's visitor complaint files throughout the late 1970s. Hikers consistently described echo effects that seemed to alter their spoken words in subtle but disturbing ways. The phenomenon appeared localized to a specific area in the northwestern section of the park, roughly encompassing 2 acres of densely packed hoodoo formations. Park Ranger Dennis Walsh began documenting the acoustic report systematically in 1978, after receiving his 4th complaint in less than a month. Walsh, a former military communications specialist, brought recording equipment to the area and attempted to document the phenomenon objectively. His initial report, filed with park headquarters in August 1978, confirmed that unusual echo effects were occurring, but noted that the alterations were difficult to capture on audio recording equipment. "The phenomenon is subtle but consistent," Walsh wrote. "Visitors speak normally, but the returning echo contains slight modifications to their words. The changes follow patterns, sword order alterations, tonal shifts, occasionally completely different phrases. However, Standard recording equipment seems unable to capture these modifications. The echoes sound normal on playback, despite multiple witnesses hearing the alterations in real time. Walsh's investigation revealed additional details about the acoustic anomaly's characteristics. The effects appeared strongest during midday hours when the sun was directly overhead and seemed to diminish significantly during early morning and evening periods. Weather conditions also influenced the phenomenon, with clear, dry days producing the most pronounced alterations. Most significantly, the echo modifications appeared to respond to the emotional content of spoken words, with neutral statements remaining largely unchanged, while emotional expressions underwent more dramatic alterations. Dr. Patricia Santos, an acoustics researcher from the University of Utah, visited Goblin Valley in September 1979 to investigate the reported phenomenon. Santos brought sophisticated audio analysis equipment and spent 3 days conducting controlled tests in the affected area. Her preliminary findings, documented in a letter to Park Superintendent Margaret Chen, confirmed that unusual acoustic properties existed but defied conventional explanation. The rock formations create a complex acoustic environment that could theoretically produce unusual echo effects, Santos wrote. However, the specific alterations described by witnesses' semantic modifications, rather than simple distortion, fall outside the range of known acoustic phenomena. The hoodoos' shape and composition could create interference patterns, but not the kind of intelligent modification that visitors consistently report. Santos recommended a comprehensive acoustic study involving multiple researchers and extended observation periods. However, her proposal was complicated by the arrival of Dr. Michael Webb, a geology professor from the University of Utah who had developed an intense interest in the park's acoustic anomalies. Webb began visiting Goblin Valley regularly in late 1979, conducting what he described as geological research, but spending most of his time in the acoustically anomalous area with recording equipment and notebooks. Webb's behavior grew increasingly erratic throughout 1980. Park rangers reported that he would spend entire days standing among the hoodoos, speaking continuously to himself and recording the conversations. He filled dozens of notebooks with transcribed dialogues, though rangers who observed him noted that he appeared to be responding to voices that only he could hear. Webb's academic colleagues at the University of Utah expressed concern about his mental state and attempted to limit his access to research funding. Professor Webb became obsessed with the idea that the rock formations were storing and replaying conversations from the past, recalled Dr. Richard Morrison, Webb's department chair. He claimed the echoes weren't random alterations but fragments of historical speech patterns embedded in the stone. His academic work suffered significantly, and we had to revoke his research privileges after he began disrupting classes with theories about geological memory and acoustic archaeology. Webb's final visit to Goblin Valley occurred on October 15, 1981. Park records show that he entered the park alone, carrying his usual research equipment, and headed directly for the northwestern section, where the acoustic anomalies were most pronounced. Rangers conducting their evening patrol found his vehicle still parked at the trailhead after closing time, but Webb himself was nowhere to be found. The search for Webb involved multiple agencies and extended for 6 days. Search and rescue teams covered the entire park systematically, using helicopters, tracking dogs, and ground crews familiar with the area's complex terrain. Webb's research equipment was found scattered among the hoodoos in the acoustically anomalous area, but showed no signs of damage or struggle. His notebooks were recovered intact, filled with increasingly illegible handwriting that appeared to document conversations with unknown individuals. The search was thorough and professional, recalled Sheriff's Deputy Robert Chen, who coordinated the ground search efforts. We covered every square foot of that park, including areas that required technical climbing equipment to access. Professor Webb simply vanished without a trace. The only unusual aspect was that our radio communications were unreliable in the area where we found his equipment. We experienced significant static and interference that made coordination difficult. Webb's disappearance prompted the Park Service to restrict access to the northwestern section of Goblin Valley, pending a safety review. However, the restriction was quietly lifted after 3 months, when no additional incidents occurred. Official park materials began omitting references to the acoustic anomalies, and staff were instructed to redirect visitor inquiries about echo effects to general information about the park's geological features. The University of Utah launched its own investigation into Webb's disappearance, focusing on his research methods and mental state prior to the incident. Dr. Santos was asked to review Webb's notebooks and research materials, but she found his later entries largely incomprehensible. The documents contained detailed transcriptions of conversations that seemed to span decades or centuries, with participants speaking in archaic language patterns and discussing historical events that predated European settlement of the region. Professor Webb's later work showed clear signs of psychological deterioration, Santos noted in her report to university administrators. However, some of his transcribed conversations contained historical details that would have required extensive research to fabricate. References to specific events, dates, and individuals that we were able to verify through historical records. It's unclear how he would have obtained such detailed information about 19th century events in the San Rafael Desert. Federal investigators briefly examined the case in 1982, focusing on the possibility that Webb had encountered illegal activity in the remote park area. However, their investigation found no evidence of foul play or criminal activity. The case was officially classified as a missing persons incident and transferred to state authorities, who maintained an open file until 1987, when Webb was declared legally dead. Park visitor reports of acoustic anomalies ceased almost entirely after Webb's disappearance. The few complaints filed in subsequent years described standard echo effects consistent with the complex rock formations, without the semantic alterations that had characterized earlier reports. Rangers noted that most visitors avoided the northwestern section of the park, though official materials provided no explanation for the area's decreased popularity. Today, Goblin Valley State Park receives thousands of visitors annually who explore the Hoodoo formations without reporting unusual acoustic experiences. The northwestern section remains accessible by trail, and park rangers report no ongoing acoustic anomalies or visitor complaints related to echo effects. Webb's disappearance is mentioned only briefly in park historical materials, classified as a tragic accident that occurred during geological research. However, sensitive listening equipment occasionally picks up faint conversations among the hoodoos during midday hours when the sun stands directly overhead. The voices speak in overlapping fragments, discussing weather patterns, cattle movements, and family news from decades past. Park maintenance crews sometimes pause their work to listen, uncertain whether the sounds represent wind through stone formations or something more persistent echoing through the valley's complex acoustic chambers. The conversations continue their quiet circulation among the goblin-shaped stones, waiting for someone with the patience to transcribe their scattered memories of words that may never have been spoken aloud. Sometimes, the airwaves remember broadcasts that were never transmitted. Kanab sits in the high desert of southern Utah, a town of 3,600 residents surrounded by red rock canyons and sage-covered mesas that stretch toward the Arizona border. Founded in 1870 by Mormon pioneers seeking grazing land for their cattle, Kanab developed into a regional center for ranching and later film production. Hollywood discovered the area's dramatic landscapes in the 1920s, and dozens of Western movies were filmed among the towering sandstone formations that frame the town on 3 sides. The community's isolation shaped its character throughout the 20th century. Kanab lies 60 miles from the nearest city of comparable size, connected to the outside world by 2-lane highways that wind through sparsely populated canyon country. Radio communication provided the town's primary link to regional news and weather information, with residents relying on stations broadcasting from Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, and Phoenix to maintain contact with events beyond their desert valley. Local radio service began in 1948 when KDYL established a low-power repeater station to serve the Kanab area. The repeater operated successfully until 1963, when it was decommissioned due to maintenance costs and declining listenership. For the following decade, Kanab residents depended entirely on distant stations for radio programming, accepting the spotty reception that characterized high desert broadcasting conditions. The phantom broadcasts began on October 12, 1974, when night shift worker Robert Chen first noticed an unfamiliar radio signal while monitoring equipment at the Kanab Municipal Power Plant. Chen was responsible for overnight operations at the plant, including monitoring emergency communications equipment that required constant radio contact with regional utilities. According to his shift log, he discovered the signal at approximately 2:50 a.m. while scanning frequencies for weather updates. I was tuning through the dial looking for overnight news when I picked up this local-sounding station, Chen wrote in his incident report filed with plant supervisor Margaret Walsh. The announcer was giving weather for Kanab, talking about tomorrow's forecast like he was right here in town, but I knew every radio station in the area, and this wasn't one of them. The call letters were KUTH, broadcasting on 107.3 FM. Chen documented several nights of the mysterious broadcasts, noting that they appeared consistently between 2:47 and 3:12 a.m. The programming followed the format of a typical small-town radio station from the early 1960s. Local news, weather reports, community announcements, and advertisements for Kanab businesses. However, the content seemed frozen in time, referencing events, weather patterns, and commercial establishments from approximately 1962. The broadcasts mentioned businesses that had closed years earlier, including Morrison's hardware store, which shut down in 1968, and the Desert Rose Motel, which was demolished in 1971 to make room for a gas station. Weather reports consistently predicted conditions that matched historical records from 1962 rather than current atmospheric patterns. Most unsettling were the community announcements, which discussed local events like church socials, school board meetings, and cattle sales that had occurred more than a decade in the past. Kanab residents began noticing the broadcasts throughout the autumn of 1974. Radio enthusiast Dennis Patterson, who operated a ham radio station from his home on the town's east side, confirmed Chen's observations and began recording the mysterious transmissions. Patterson's recordings, preserved in the Kanab Historical Society's archives, capture nearly 3 hours of programming that appears professionally produced despite the station's apparent non-existence. The quality was excellent, better than most of the distant stations we could normally receive, Patterson explained in a 1975 interview with the Kane County Standard. Professional announcers, clear signal strength, proper station identification. Everything sounded exactly like a real radio station, except for the content being 12 years out of date. The disc jockey would play songs from the early 60s and talk about current events from 1962 like they were happening that night. Patterson's recordings reveal additional details about the Phantom station's programming. The announcer, who identified himself as Jim Morrison, your overnight voice for southern Utah, delivered news reports that referenced the Cuban Missile Crisis as an ongoing situation, discussed President Kennedy's policies in present tense, and provided livestock market reports using prices from the early 1960s. Commercial advertisements promoted products and services available in 1962 Kanab, including businesses that had been closed for more than a decade. Local businessman Thomas Walsh, whose family had operated Walsh's automotive service until 1969, heard advertisements for his father's garage during the Phantom broadcasts. The ads featured his father's voice, despite the fact that Henry Walsh had died in 1971. The advertisements promoted automotive services using prices and terminology consistent with the early 1960s automotive industry. I recognized my father's voice immediately, Walsh told investigators. He'd recorded those commercials for the local station back in '62, but hearing them again in 74 years after he'd passed away and the garage had closed was deeply unsettling. The ads talked about services we'd offered and prices we'd charged more than a decade earlier. The phenomenon attracted attention from the Federal Communications Commission in early 1975, when multiple residents filed complaints about unlicensed broadcasting in their area. FCC investigator Dr. Patricia Santos arrived in Kanab in March 1975 with signal detection equipment designed to locate unauthorized transmitters. Her investigation, documented in a report filed with the FCC's Salt Lake City office, confirmed the existence of the broadcasts, but failed to identify their source. Signal strength measurements indicate a local transmitter operating at significant power, Santos wrote in her preliminary report. However, triangulation attempts consistently point to an empty lot on the south side of town where no broadcasting equipment exists. We conducted thorough searches of the indicated area and found no evidence of transmitter installation, either current or historical. Santos's investigation revealed that the lot indicated by triangulation equipment had never housed a radio station. Property records dating back to the town's founding showed continuous residential use until 1968, when the lot was cleared for commercial development that never materialized. Soil analysis revealed no evidence of buried cables, foundations, or other infrastructure associated with broadcast facilities. The FCC expanded its investigation in the summer of 1975, bringing additional detection equipment and technical specialists to Kanab. The team spent 6 weeks monitoring the phantom broadcasts and attempting to trace their origin. However, their final report, classified upon completion, acknowledged that the investigation had failed to locate any physical transmitter responsible for the signals. Despite extensive technical analysis, we were unable to identify the source of the unlicensed broadcasts, the report concluded. The signals appear to originate from coordinates where no transmitter exists, broadcasting content that predates the investigation by more than a decade. This case presents technical anomalies that fall outside the scope of standard FCC enforcement procedures. The investigation was quietly closed in September 1975 without public announcement. FCC officials informed Kanab residents that the matter had been resolved, though no explanation was provided for the broadcast source or their sudden cessation. The Phantom station went silent on September 23, 1975, ending more than 11 months of nightly transmissions. However, the broadcasts resumed intermittently throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Kanab residents reported occasional reception of KUTH programming during the overnight hours, always featuring the same 1962 content and always broadcasting from the same apparently empty coordinates. The appearances became increasingly sporadic, occurring perhaps once or twice per year rather than nightly. Local radio technician Michael Morrison attempted independent investigation of the phenomenon in 1979, using borrowed equipment to monitor the Phantom station's frequency. Morrison's technical analysis, submitted to the Kane County Standard, confirmed that the broadcast showed characteristics of professional radio transmission despite the absence of any identifiable transmitter. The signal processing, modulation depth, and frequency stability all indicate sophisticated broadcast equipment, Morrison wrote. This isn't someone with a low-power transmitter playing old recordings. The technical quality suggests a full-power commercial radio station, yet no such facility exists anywhere in the area. Morrison's investigation also revealed that the Phantom broadcasts occurred only during specific atmospheric conditions. Clear, dry nights with minimal wind produced the strongest signals, while overcast or stormy weather resulted in no reception at all. The correlation between weather patterns and signal strength suggested that the broadcasts might depend on particular atmospheric conditions for transmission or reception. The last confirmed reception of KUTH occurred on October 12, 1983, exactly 9 years after the first documented broadcast. Radio enthusiast Sarah Henderson recorded 15 minutes of programming before the signal faded permanently. Henderson's recording captured the final sign-off message, in which announcer Jim Morrison thanked listeners for their attention and promised to return when conditions permit. Current radio frequency monitoring shows no activity on 107.3 FM in the Kanab area. The frequency remains officially unassigned, with no applications for broadcasting licenses on file with the FCC. Modern signal detection equipment finds no evidence of transmitter activity at the coordinates identified during the 1970s investigation. The empty lot where triangulation equipment consistently pointed remains undeveloped, though it changed ownership several times during the 1980s and 90s. Current property records show the lot owned by the city of Kanab, designated for potential municipal development, that has never materialized. No plans exist for construction on the site, and city officials report no knowledge of its connection to the phantom radio broadcasts. Today, Kanab residents who remember the KUTH broadcasts speak of them as a curious chapter in local history, a brief period when their radios picked up voices from the past discussing weather that had already changed and promoting businesses that existed only in memory. The recordings preserved by the Historical Society continue to document nearly 3 hours of programming from a station that broadcast regularly for 11 months without ever officially existing, featuring the voice of announcer Jim Morrison delivering news from 1962 to listeners in 1974, as though time itself had found a frequency where past and present could briefly coexist in the high desert air above Kanab. Sometimes, cameras capture places that exist only in the space between exposures. Zion National Park encompasses 147,000 acres of red and white sandstone canyons in southwestern Utah, where the Virgin River has carved a path through layers of rock deposited over millions of years. The park's main canyon stretches 15 miles from the Zion Mount Carmel Tunnel to the Temple of Sinawava, creating a narrow corridor between towering walls that rise more than 2,000 feet above the valley floor. Early Mormon settlers named the area Zion, believing they had discovered a promised land hidden within the desert's most inaccessible reaches. The Zion Canyon Visitor Center was constructed in 1966 to accommodate the increasing number of tourists drawn to the park's spectacular formations. The building sits at the canyon's mouth, where the Virgin River emerges from the narrow gorge into the broader Zion Valley. Park rangers stationed at the visitor center provided information, issued permits, and maintained exhibits about the area's geology and natural history. The center also served as a focal point for search and rescue operations, given the park's challenging terrain and the tendency of visitors to underestimate the dangers posed by flash floods and extreme weather conditions. The building's design reflected the mid-century modernist approach to park architecture, with large windows and open floor plans intended to blur the boundaries between indoor and outdoor spaces. A darkroom facility was included in the original construction to support the park's educational photography programs and to process film for rangers documenting wildlife behavior and geological changes. The darkroom operated continuously from 1966 until 1985, when digital photography began replacing film-based documentation methods. The anomalous photographs first appeared on the morning of September 14, 1979, when park photographer Janet Morrison developed images in the visitor center darkroom that she had not processed. Morrison was responsible for maintaining the park's photographic archives and regularly used the darkroom to develop film from ranger patrols and educational programs. According to her incident report filed that morning, she found a roll of 35mm film hanging in the developer that contained images she had never seen before. "I knew I hadn't processed that film," Morrison wrote in her report to Chief Ranger Dennis Walsh. "I keep careful records of every roll that goes through the darkroom, and this wasn't on my log." The images showed desert terrain that didn't match any location in Zion. Flat, sandy landscape with scattered rock formations that looked almost like Zion geology, but arranged completely differently. Like someone had taken pictures of a place that was similar to our park but not actually our park. The film showed 24 exposures of the same general area photographed from various angles and distances. The landscape featured red sandstone formations similar to those found throughout southern Utah, but the specific arrangement of rocks, mesas, and washes matched no known location within or near Zion National Park. The photographs appeared professionally composed, with careful attention to lighting and framing that suggested an experienced photographer familiar with desert terrain. Morrison initially assumed the film belonged to a park visitor who had accidentally left it in the darkroom, though this would have required access to the facility after hours. She posted notices in the visitor center asking if anyone had lost undeveloped film, but received no responses. The darkroom was kept locked when not in use, with access limited to park employees who possessed keys. Security logs showed no unauthorized entry to the building on the night the film was discovered. Additional rolls of mysterious film appeared irregularly throughout the autumn of 1979. Morrison documented 7 separate incidents between September and December, each involving a single roll of 35mm film that materialized in the darkroom overnight. The images consistently showed the same unfamiliar desert landscape, though photographed from different perspectives and at different times of day based on the lighting conditions visible in the exposures. The photographs were definitely taken in a desert environment similar to southern Utah, Morrison noted in her December 1979 summary report. Red rock formations, sparse vegetation, typical high desert terrain, but the specific combination of features didn't match any location I could identify. I've lived in this area for 15 years and thought I knew every significant geological formation within 100 miles of the park. Park rangers began investigating the phenomenon in early 1980, when the appearance of mysterious film became a weekly occurrence. Chief Ranger Walsh assigned Ranger Robert Chen to monitor the darkroom overnight, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the undeveloped film. Chen's surveillance logs document 3 nights of observation in January 1980, during which no unauthorized individuals entered the darkroom, but film continued to appear. I maintained visual observation of the darkroom from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. on 3 consecutive nights, Chen reported. The room remained locked and undisturbed throughout each shift. However, on the morning of January 18th, we found 2 rolls of film hanging in the developer that hadn't been there when I began my watch. The film appeared sometime during the night, without anyone entering or leaving the room. Chen's investigation revealed additional details about the mysterious photographs. The film consistently used the same brand and type Kodak Ektachrome slide film, suggesting a single source for the images. The processing appeared professional, with proper chemical treatment and development timing that produced high-quality results. Most significantly, the photographs showed progression over time, as if documenting changes in the unknown landscape across multiple seasons and weather conditions. The Park Service expanded its investigation in the spring of 1980, installing motion-activated cameras in the darkroom to document any unauthorized activity. However, the surveillance equipment consistently failed to capture images during the nights when mysterious film appeared. The cameras would function normally throughout most of each monitoring period, but would inexplicably malfunction during the specific hours when the phenomenon occurred. Dr. Patricia Santos, a photography specialist from the University of Utah, examined the mysterious images in June 1980 at the request of park management. Santos analyzed the technical aspects of the photographs, including grain structure, color saturation, and exposure characteristics. Her report confirmed that the images were genuine photographs rather than manipulated or composite images, but she could not identify their geographic origin. The photographs demonstrate consistent technical quality and appear to document a real landscape, Santos wrote in her analysis. The geological features are consistent with Colorado Plateau formations, but the specific arrangement doesn't match any map location in Utah, Arizona, Colorado, or New Mexico. It's as if someone photographed a landscape that resembles this region but exists somewhere else entirely. Santos's investigation also revealed that the photographs appeared to follow a logical sequence, documenting the same area across different seasons and times of day. Early images showed the landscape in what appeared to be winter conditions, with snow on the higher elevations and dormant vegetation. Later photographs captured the same area during spring and summer, showing the progression of plant growth and seasonal changes in lighting conditions. The mysterious film continued appearing throughout 1980 and 1981, with park officials collecting more than 150 individual rolls containing over 3,000 images of the unknown landscape. The photographs were cataloged and stored in the park's archives, with copies sent to geological surveys and university researchers in hopes of identifying the location. However, no researcher was able to match the landscape features to any known geographic area. Local Paiute tribal members expressed interest in the photographs when shown selected images in 1981. Elder Thomas Morrison examined dozens of the mysterious photographs and noted their resemblance to traditional stories about hidden landscapes that existed parallel to the known world. However, Morrison emphasized that the tribal traditions spoke of spiritual rather than physical places, and he could not identify the specific location shown in the images. "The photographs show a place that looks familiar but isn't quite right," Morrison told park officials. "Like a reflection of the land we know, but changed somehow. Our old stories talk about such places, but they exist in dreams and visions, not in the world where cameras can photograph them." The phenomenon reached its peak intensity during 1982 and 1983, when mysterious film appeared in the darkroom almost nightly. Park officials documented more than 200 separate incidents during these 2 years, accumulating thousands of photographs that continued to show the same evolving landscape. The images suggested that someone was conducting a systematic photographic survey of the unknown area, documenting it from multiple angles and elevations with the thoroughness of a professional geological expedition. However, the mysterious appearances ceased abruptly in February 1984. The last roll of unexplained film was discovered on February 23, 1984, containing images that showed the unknown landscape covered in snow and appearing somehow more distant, as if photographed from a greater elevation than previous shots. After that date, no additional mysterious film appeared in the darkroom, despite continued overnight monitoring by park staff. The National Park Service launched a formal investigation into the phenomenon in 1985, assigning a team of specialists to review the collected photographs and interview park personnel. The investigation team, led by Dr. Michael Webb from the Park Service's regional office, spent 6 months examining the evidence and attempting to identify the source of the mysterious images. Webb's final report, classified upon completion, acknowledged that the investigation had failed to explain the origin of the photographs or identify the landscape they depicted. According to leaked excerpts obtained years later, the report noted that the images appeared genuine and documented a real location. But that location could not be found within any mapped area of the southwestern United States. The entire collection of mysterious photographs disappeared from park storage in 1986. According to official records, the images were transferred to Park Service headquarters in Washington for further analysis, but no agency has acknowledged possessing the collection. Requests for information about the photographs have been consistently denied, with officials stating that no such collection exists in federal archives. Park employees who witnessed the phenomenon were transferred to other assignments throughout 1986 and 1987. Janet Morrison was reassigned to Yellowstone National Park, while Chief Ranger Walsh accepted early retirement. The darkroom facility was converted to storage space in 1985, officially due to the transition to digital photography, though some staff members noted the timing coincided with the investigation's conclusion. Today, the Zion Canyon Visitor Center continues to serve thousands of annual visitors, without any mention of the photographic phenomenon that occurred there for 5 years. The storage room that once housed the darkroom contains boxes of educational materials and maintenance supplies, with no indication of its former purpose. New employees have no knowledge of the mysterious photographs, and veteran staff members who remain from the 1980s decline to discuss the incidents when questioned by curious visitors or researchers. However, occasional reports surface of undeveloped film found in other locations throughout Zion National Park, always containing images of the same unknown landscape that was documented so thoroughly during the early 1980s. These reports are typically dismissed as tourist pranks or misidentified conventional photographs, but the images continue to surface with enough regularity to suggest that somewhere, someone is still methodically photographing a desert that exists in the space between what cameras are supposed to capture and what they sometimes choose to remember. The Earth remembers boundaries that humans never drew. Canyonlands National Park sprawls across 337,000 acres of southeastern Utah, where the Colorado and Green Rivers converge in a maze of sandstone canyons, mesas, and buttes. The park is divided into 4 distinct districts, with the Island in the Sky Mesa rising 2,000 feet above the surrounding landscape like an enormous aircraft carrier made of stone. This isolated plateau, connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of rock, stretches for 25 miles between the 2 river systems that carved the surrounding canyons over millions of years. The Island in the Sky District became part of the National Park System in 1964, though the area had been surveyed repeatedly since the late 1800s as part of various territorial and statehood mapping initiatives. Early surveyors faced significant challenges documenting the region's complex topography, with sheer cliff faces, hidden canyons, and extreme elevation changes that made precise measurement difficult. The Bureau of Land Management assumed responsibility for ongoing surveying work in 1946, establishing permanent survey markers throughout the district to support land use planning and resource management activities. The mesa's geological foundation consists primarily of Navajo sandstone deposited during the Jurassic period, when the region lay beneath a vast desert similar to today's Sahara. Wind and water erosion carved the rock into dramatic formations over the following 150 million years, creating the landscape of towering spires, natural arches, and deep canyons that characterizes the area today. Archaeological evidence suggests that ancestral Puebloan peoples occupied the mesa for more than 1,000 years, leaving behind petroglyphs, granaries, and dwelling sites that indicate sophisticated understanding of the area's seasonal water sources and travel routes. The Bureau of Land Management installed a new series of survey markers in the Island in the Sky District during the summer of 1986 as part of a comprehensive remapping project designed to update land boundaries and improve GPS coordinate accuracy. Survey team leader Robert Chen oversaw the placement of 43 permanent markers throughout the district, including a triangular formation of 3 primary reference points located on the mesa's eastern edge near the Grand View Point overlook. The 3 primary markers, designated as stations Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, were positioned to form an equilateral triangle with sides measuring exactly 100 feet. Each marker consisted of a brass disc mounted on a concrete pillar sunk 4 feet into the sandstone bedrock and secured with expansion bolts designed to withstand decades of weathering and geological movement. Chen's team used satellite positioning equipment and precision surveying instruments to establish the markers' coordinates with accuracy to within 1 centimeter. These markers were installed to professional standards using the best available technology, Chen noted in his final project report dated August 15, 1986. The concrete footings were properly cured. The brass discs were aligned to true north, and the GPS coordinates were verified multiple times before we considered the installation complete. These markers should remain stable for 50 years or more under normal conditions. The first evidence of marker displacement appeared during a routine inspection conducted by Bureau Surveyor Margaret Walsh on October 3, 1986. Walsh was documenting the condition of newly installed markers throughout the district when she discovered that the triangular formation near Grand View Point had shifted position. According to her field notes, each of the 3 markers had moved exactly 47 feet in a northwest direction while maintaining their precise triangular relationship. The markers were no longer where we'd placed them, Walsh wrote in her inspection report. They'd moved as a unit, maintaining the exact same spacing and orientation, but in a completely different location. The concrete footings showed no signs of disturbance, and the brass discs were still perfectly aligned. It was as if someone had picked up the entire triangular formation and moved it 47 feet northwest. Walsh's measurements confirmed that the markers had indeed relocated while preserving their geometric relationship down to the centimeter. The triangle remained perfectly equilateral with 100-foot sides, and the brass discs maintained their original orientation relative to magnetic north. However, GPS readings showed that each marker now occupied coordinates that placed them 47 feet northwest of their documented installation positions. Bureau of Land Management officials initially suspected vandalism or equipment theft, though the concrete pillars showed no evidence of having been disturbed or reinstalled. The markers appeared to have moved intact, complete with their substantial concrete footings, without leaving any trace of excavation or construction at either the original or new locations. Security investigations found no tire tracks, tool marks, or other signs of human activity in the area. Chen returned to the site on October 8th to verify Walsh's findings and conduct additional measurements. His report confirmed the 47-foot displacement and noted several details that made conventional explanations increasingly unlikely. The original installation sites showed no evidence of the concrete footings that should have remained if the markers had been physically removed. Conversely, the new locations showed no signs of recent excavation, despite the presence of substantial concrete foundations. The markers appear to have moved without leaving any trace of how the movement occurred, Chen wrote in his supplemental report. The original sites look exactly as they would if no markers had ever been installed there. The new sites look exactly as they would if the markers had always been in those positions. There's no physical evidence of the relocation process itself. The Bureau decided to reset the markers to their original coordinates on October 15th, using the same installation procedures that had been employed during the initial survey. Chen's team excavated the displaced markers, transported them back to their original positions, and reinstalled them with fresh concrete foundations. GPS verification confirmed that the markers were restored to their precise original coordinates. However, the markers resumed their migration immediately. Daily inspections conducted throughout late October and early November documented gradual displacement at a rate of approximately 6 inches per day in a consistent northwest direction. The movement appeared to occur primarily during nighttime hours, with minimal displacement observed during daytime monitoring periods. "We tried everything to keep those markers in place," recalled surveyor Dennis Patterson, who participated in multiple reset attempts. "We increased the size of the concrete footings, used different anchoring systems, even installed motion-activated cameras to catch whoever was moving them. But they kept migrating northwest at the same steady pace, night after night, regardless of what we did to secure them." The Bureau conducted extensive investigations throughout 1987, bringing in specialists in geology, surveying, and security to examine the phenomenon. Patricia Santos, a geologist from the University of Utah, analyzed soil and rock samples from both the original and displaced marker locations, but found no geological factors that might explain the movement. Her report noted that the sandstone bedrock was stable and showed no signs of seismic activity or structural instability. The geological conditions at all marker locations are essentially identical, Santos wrote in her analysis. Solid Navajo sandstone with no fractures, fault lines, or other structural features that might contribute to ground movement. The rock formation is among the most stable in the region, which makes the marker displacement particularly puzzling. Security specialist Michael Morrison installed motion-activated cameras and seismic monitoring equipment around the marker triangle in the spring of 1987. His surveillance system documented the gradual marker movement, but failed to capture any images of the displacement process. The cameras would show the markers in one position at sunset and in a new position at sunrise, but the overnight footage revealed no activity or disturbance. The markers would be in one location when we checked them in the evening, and 47 feet northwest when we returned the next morning, Morrison explained in his security report. The cameras were functioning properly. The seismic equipment detected no ground movement, and there was no evidence of human interference. The markers simply relocated themselves overnight without any observable mechanism. Bureau officials decided to install a new set of markers in different locations throughout the island in the Sky District to determine whether the phenomenon was specific to the Grandview Point area. Survey teams placed additional triangular formations at Mesa Arch, Upheaval Dome, and White Rim, overlooked during the summer of 1987. Within weeks, all three new formations began exhibiting the same migration pattern, moving precisely 47 feet northwest every few days, while maintaining their geometric relationships. The consistent displacement distance of 47 feet attracted attention from researchers studying geomagnetic anomalies and Earth measurement systems. Dr. Richard Webb, a geophysicist from Colorado State University, noted that 47 feet represented a significant measurement in several indigenous surveying traditions, and suggested that the displacement might relate to natural magnetic or gravitational phenomena not yet understood by conventional science. The precision of the displacement suggests an underlying pattern or force that operates according to consistent principles, Webb wrote in his preliminary analysis. The fact that multiple marker formations exhibit identical behavior indicates a regional phenomenon rather than isolated incidents. This could represent evidence of natural processes that haven't been previously documented. However, Webb's request for federal funding to conduct comprehensive research was denied without explanation in early 1988. His subsequent applications for university grants and private research support were also rejected, with funding agencies citing insufficient scientific basis for the proposed studies. Webb's academic career suffered after his continued advocacy for marker displacement research, and he accepted early retirement in 1990. The Bureau of Land Management officially discontinued efforts to maintain survey markers in the Island in the Sky district in 1989, citing cost concerns and practical difficulties associated with the ongoing displacement phenomena. Internal memos obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests show that Bureau officials were instructed to classify the marker incidents as equipment malfunction rather than acknowledge unexplained movement. Current surveys of Canyonlands National Park use satellite GPS positioning exclusively, without relying on permanent ground markers for reference points. Park rangers report that visitors occasionally discover old survey markers in unexpected locations throughout the Island in the Sky district, but these findings are attributed to historical surveying errors rather than ongoing displacement phenomena. The original marker triangle from Grand View Point has continued its northwest migration for more than 3 decades, covering approximately 30 miles from its original installation site. Based on consistent movement rates documented through the late 1980s, the formation should now be located somewhere in the remote backcountry north of the Upheaval Dome area, still maintaining its precise geometric relationship while pursuing its methodical journey toward an unknown destination. Local guides familiar with the park's backcountry report occasional sightings of survey markers in areas where no official installations have ever been documented. These markers appear weathered and aged, as though they've occupied their current positions for decades, yet they sit in locations that have never been officially surveyed or marked. The brass discs remain perfectly aligned to magnetic north, and the concrete foundations show no signs of recent installation, as though the markers have always belonged in their current positions, despite the impossibility of their presence there. Gravity, it seems, sometimes forgets which direction is down. Capitol Reef National Park preserves 100 miles of the Water Pocket Fold, a massive geological wrinkle in the Earth's crust that exposes 200 million years of sedimentary rock layers across south-central Utah. The park encompasses 241,000 acres of desert wilderness, where ancient seas, swamps, and sand dunes left their signatures in stone that now rises in dramatic cliffs and hidden canyons. Sulphur Creek winds through the heart of this landscape, carrying seasonal runoff from the high country down through narrow gorges toward its confluence with the Fremont River. The creek follows a path carved over millions of years, through layers of Wingate sandstone, Kayenta Formation, and Navajo sandstone that tell the story of changing climates and rising seas. Indigenous peoples, primarily Fremont culture groups, occupied the area from approximately 300 to 1300 AD, leaving petroglyphs and granaries in the cliff faces above the creek. Mormon pioneers established the settlement of Fruta along the creek's banks in 1878, taking advantage of the reliable water source to create an oasis of orchards and farmland in the surrounding desert. Sulphur Creek's flow varies dramatically with the seasons, running as a substantial stream during spring snowmelt and summer thunderstorms, but often reduced to isolated pools during the dry months of late summer and early autumn. The creek's name derives from mineral springs that emerge from underground aquifers in the upper watershed, giving the water a distinctive taste and slight yellow tint that early settlers found objectionable for drinking but useful for medicinal purposes. Park hydrologists have monitored the creek's flow rates and water quality since the area became a national monument in 1937. The flow reversal began on July 8, 1988, during what should have been the creek's normal summer recession period. Park maintenance worker Janet Morrison first noticed the anomaly while conducting routine trail maintenance along the creek's lower reaches near the Fruita Historic District. According to her incident report filed that evening, she observed water flowing upstream toward the creek's headwaters rather than downstream toward the Fremont River confluence. "I thought there must be a beaver dam or some kind of blockage causing backflow," Morrison wrote in her July 8 report to Chief Ranger Dennis Walsh. "But when I walked upstream to investigate, the water was flowing uphill as far as I could see, not just backed up, but actively flowing against gravity. I dropped the stick in the water and watched it float upstream, carried by a current that was definitely moving toward the creek's source." Morrison's observations were initially met with skepticism from park management, who suggested she had misidentified the direction of water flow or encountered a temporary hydraulic effect caused by debris obstruction. However, additional staff members confirmed the anomaly over the following days, with multiple witnesses documenting water flowing consistently upstream throughout the creek's 8-mile length within park boundaries. Park Ranger Robert Chen conducted systematic observations of the flow reversal throughout the second week of July, documenting water movement at various points along Sulphur Creek, using both visual markers and scientific instruments. Chen's measurements confirmed that water was flowing upstream at approximately 2 feet per second, a significant current velocity that carried sediment, leaves, and other debris toward the creek's headwaters in the high country above Capitol Reef. "The flow was definitely reversed," Chen noted in his July 15th summary report. "I measured current velocity at 12 different locations along the creek, and every reading showed upstream flow at consistent rates. The water was carrying sediment and organic material upstream, depositing it in areas that would normally be scoured clean by downstream flow. It was like watching a river run backward." Chen's investigation revealed additional anomalies that accompanied the reversed flow. Fish behavior appeared normal despite the unusual current direction, with trout continuing their typical feeding patterns as though nothing had changed. Water temperature and dissolved oxygen levels remained within normal ranges for the season. Most puzzling, the creek's flow rate showed no increase despite the apparent addition of water from tributaries that would normally contribute to downstream volume. Dr. Patricia Santos, a hydrologist from Utah State University, arrived at Capitol Reef on July 20th to investigate the phenomenon as part of a broader study of regional water systems. Santos brought sophisticated flow measurement equipment and water analysis tools to document the reversed current and determine its underlying cause. Her preliminary findings, documented in field notes that were later confiscated, confirmed the presence of upstream flow throughout Sulphur Creek. "Standard hydrological principles suggest this phenomenon should be impossible," Santos wrote in her initial observations. "Water flows downhill due to gravitational force, following the path of least resistance toward lower elevations. Yet our measurements consistently show water moving uphill against a significant elevation gradient. The creek rises approximately 400 feet over its 8-mile length within park boundaries, yet water flows from the lower elevation toward the higher elevation." Santos conducted extensive testing of the water's chemical composition and physical properties, searching for unusual characteristics that might explain the reversed flow. Her analysis revealed normal mineral content, consistent with the creek's sulfur springs, standard pH levels, and typical dissolved solids for the region. However, her gravitational measurements produced readings that contradicted the observed water movement. The most disturbing aspect of this phenomenon is that our instruments show normal gravitational force throughout the area, Santos noted in her research log. Gravity is pulling downward with standard force, yet the water flows upward. This suggests either equipment malfunction or physical processes that fall outside conventional understanding of fluid dynamics and gravitational effects. Additional researchers joined Santos's investigation in early August, including geophysicist Dr. Michael Webb from the University of Utah and water resources specialist Dr. Margaret Chen from the U.S. Geological Survey. The expanded research team installed monitoring stations along Sulphur Creek to collect continuous data on flow rates, water chemistry, and gravitational measurements. Their preliminary data confirmed the upstream flow while raising additional questions about the phenomenon's persistence and scope. We documented 6 weeks of consistent upstream flow with no indication that the phenomenon was weakening or becoming intermittent, Webb noted in his interim report dated August 15th. The water's upstream velocity remained constant despite normal seasonal variation in precipitation and temperature. This suggests an underlying cause that operates independently of typical hydrological factors. Local residents familiar with the area expressed varying degrees of concern about the flow reversal, with some longtime park employees noting that unusual water behavior had been reported sporadically throughout the region's recorded history. Maintenance supervisor Thomas Morrison, who had worked in Capitol Reef for 15 years, recalled previous incidents of strange water movement in isolated sections of Sulphur Creek during drought years. We'd had reports before of water acting strangely in certain areas during dry spells, Morrison explained to researchers. Nothing as dramatic as what we saw in '88, but isolated pools that seemed to drain upward, or sections where debris would collect at the upstream end instead of washing downstream. Most of us figured it was related to underground springs or cave systems that we didn't fully understand. The research team's investigation was abruptly terminated on August 22nd when federal officials arrived at Capitol Reef with orders to confiscate all data related to the Sulphur Creek study. Dr. Santos and her colleagues were informed that their research permits had been revoked due to national security concerns related to water resource monitoring near sensitive facilities. The researchers were required to surrender all equipment, data, and documentation before leaving the park. We were given no explanation for the permit revocation or the security classification of our research, Santos later stated in a letter to university administrators. Our study involved standard hydrological monitoring techniques that pose no conceivable security threat. The abrupt termination and data confiscation suggest that our findings were considered significant enough to warrant federal intervention, though we were never told why. The Sulphur Creek flow reversal ended as suddenly as it had begun, with normal downstream flow resuming on August 23rd, less than 24 hours after the research team's departure. Park rangers conducting routine patrols found the creek flowing normally toward the Fremont River, with no evidence of the 6-week period during which water had defied gravitational physics. Sediment deposits that had accumulated in upstream areas during the reversed flow period were quickly redistributed by the restored downstream current. Park officials received no follow-up communication from the federal agencies that had terminated the research investigation. Internal National Park Service memos regarding the incident were classified and remained sealed, despite Freedom of Information Act requests. The 3 university researchers who participated in the study were reassigned to different projects, and none have been granted permits for subsequent water research in Capitol Reef or other national parks. Official park records contain only brief references to temporary flow monitoring, conducted in Sulphur Creek during the summer of 1988. Visitor guides and interpretive materials make no mention of the flow reversal, and current park rangers report no knowledge of unusual water behavior in the creek. The incident has been effectively erased from the park's official history, despite the existence of witness accounts and photographic evidence documenting the 6-week period when physics appeared to operate in reverse. Dr. Santos continued to investigate similar phenomena at other locations throughout the southwestern United States until her unexpected death in a hiking accident in 1992. Her personal research files, donated to Utah State University, contain references to gravitational anomalies and hydrological impossibilities observed at various sites. Those specific details were apparently removed before the files were made available to researchers. Today, Sulphur Creek follows its normal course through Capitol Reef, flowing downstream toward the Fremont River in accordance with gravitational principles that have governed water movement for billions of years. Visitors hiking along the creek observe typical desert stream behavior, with seasonal variations in flow rate and water clarity that reflect normal precipitation patterns and underground spring activity. Nothing in the current landscape suggests that water once flowed uphill for 6 weeks, carrying the desert's debris toward mountain peaks in defiance of the fundamental forces that shape how water moves through the world. Yet sensitive instruments occasionally register brief gravitational fluctuations along certain sections of Sulphur Creek, momentary variations that last only seconds and produce readings that contradict the observed behavior of water and sediment. These anomalies occur most frequently during the late summer months, when the creek's flow drops to its seasonal minimum and the silence of the desert allows careful observers to notice the subtle ways that water sometimes hesitates before remembering which direction leads downhill toward the distant river. Some names write themselves into places they were never meant to be. Wendover sits precisely on the Utah-Nevada border, a town split by state lines where the Bonneville Salt Flats meet the endless Nevada desert. Established in 1907 as a railroad water stop on the Western Pacific Line, Wendover grew into a peculiar community defined by its geographic position, straddling 2 states with vastly different laws regarding gambling and entertainment. The Nevada side developed into a casino town, while the Utah side remained dry and conservative, creating a cultural divide that ran literally down the middle of Wendover Boulevard. The Wendover Nugget Hotel opened in 1958 on the Nevada side of town, a modest 40-room establishment catering to travelers crossing the desert and gamblers seeking affordable accommodations near the larger casinos. Built in the utilitarian style typical of mid-century Nevada hospitality, the hotel featured basic amenities and a small restaurant that served standard American fare to truckers, railroad workers, and the occasional tourist drawn by the area's reputation for wide-open spaces and 24-hour entertainment. The hotel's location placed it at the intersection of several major transportation routes, including U.S. Highway 40 and the Transcontinental Railroad, making it a natural stopping point for travelers crossing the American West. The surrounding landscape offered little beyond salt flats and sagebrush, creating a sense of isolation that many visitors found either liberating or unsettling depending on their disposition and reasons for being in Wendover. The signature first appeared in the hotel's guest register on March 12, 1971, when night desk clerk Robert Chen recorded the arrival of J. Morrison, Denver, CO, in room 23. According to Chen's shift log, the guest paid for a single night in cash and provided a local phone number for contact purposes. The registration appeared routine except for Chen's notation that he had no memory of actually meeting or speaking with the guest, despite being on duty throughout the night shift. I filled out the register entry, but I couldn't remember the guest arriving or checking in. Chen wrote in a memo to hotel manager Dennis Walsh, dated March 13th. The cash payment was on the desk in the morning, the correct amount for the room rate, but I had no recollection of the transaction. I thought maybe I'd dozed off during the quiet hours, but the timing didn't make sense with my other activities that night. The room showed evidence of occupancy the following morning, with the bed slept in and towels used, but housekeeping staff reported no personal belongings left behind, and no indication of who had stayed there. Most puzzling, the local phone number provided by J. Morrison was not assigned to any subscriber according to the telephone company's records. The number followed the correct format for Wendover exchanges, but had never been issued to a customer. The signature appeared again on April 9, 1971, recorded by day shift clerk Margaret Morrison, who noted the same name, address, and phone number in identical handwriting. Morrison's incident report described finding the registration entry completed when she arrived for her morning shift, though the night clerk, Thomas Patterson, insisted he had processed no arrivals during his overnight duties. The register showed J. Morrison checked into room 18, but Tom said nobody had come to the desk all night. Morrison wrote, "The cash payment was there, and the room had been used, but nobody remembered seeing the guest." The handwriting looked exactly like the previous entry from last month, down to the specific way the letters were formed. Hotel staff began paying closer attention to the J. Morrison registrations, which appeared with remarkable consistency approximately once per month throughout 1971 and 1972. Each entry showed identical handwriting, the same Denver address, and the unassigned phone number. Room assignments varied, but the pattern remained constant. Cash payment left at the front desk, evidence of room occupancy, and no staff member with any memory of interacting with the guest. Night manager Patricia Santos documented her observations in a series of memos to hotel ownership, noting that the J.I.S. Morrison registrations coincided with unexplained gaps in staff memory and small discrepancies in the hotel's daily operations. Security cameras installed in the lobby in 1972 failed to capture images of J2WW Morrison arriving or departing, though they clearly recorded other guests and staff members throughout the same time periods. The cameras work fine for everyone else, but we never get footage of this particular guest, Santos wrote in her October 1972 report. "It's like the registration happens. The room gets used, the payment appears, but the actual person never exists on film. We've checked the equipment multiple times, and it functions normally except during the hours when J. Morrison supposedly checks in." Denver telephone directories from the 1970s contain no listing for J. Morrison at the address provided in the hotel registrations. City records show the address corresponding to an empty lot that had been cleared for development in 1968 but never built upon. Colorado State motor vehicle records contain no driver's license or vehicle registration for anyone named J. Morrison at that address during the relevant time period. Hotel employees from the 1970s described the J. Morrison phenomenon as an accepted peculiarity of working at the Wendover Nugget, something that happened regularly but was rarely discussed openly. Day shift supervisor Karen Walsh recalled that staff members developed an informal policy of simply accommodating the monthly registrations without attempting to investigate or explain them. "We all knew about J. Morrison, but nobody talked about it much," Walsh explained in a 1998 interview. "It was just something that happened at the hotel. Once a month, the name would appear in the register, a room would be used, and we'd find cash payment in the morning. Management told us to treat it like any other reservation and not to make a big deal about it." Housekeeping staff reported that rooms assigned to J. Morrison showed minimal use despite clear evidence of occupancy. Beds would be slept in but sheets barely wrinkled, towels used but still neatly folded, and no personal items or trash left behind. The rooms never required more than routine cleaning, as though the occupant had been extraordinarily careful not to disturb the space. "It was the cleanest guest we ever had," recalled housekeeper Linda Patterson. "The room would look lived in, but not messy, used but not disturbed. No luggage marks on the furniture, no personal belongings in the drawers or bathroom, nothing to indicate who had stayed there or what they were doing in Wendover." The hotel's management company commissioned a private investigation into the J. Morrison registrations in 1974, hiring a Las Vegas-based security firm to monitor the hotel during the expected monthly appearances. The investigators installed additional surveillance equipment and maintained 24-hour observation for 3 consecutive months, but failed to document any unusual activity or identify the source of the mysterious registrations. Lead investigator Dr. Michael Webb submitted a report concluding that the J. Morrison registrations represented either an elaborate hoax perpetrated by hotel staff or a form of systematic record-keeping error that had become institutionalized over time. However, Webb's report acknowledged that his investigation had produced no evidence supporting either theory and that the phenomenon remained unexplained. Despite extensive surveillance and investigation, we were unable to identify any individual responsible for the J. Morrison registrations, Webb wrote in his final report. The handwriting analysis indicates a single person consistently completing the entries, yet no such person has been observed or documented. This case presents investigative challenges that fall outside conventional security assessment procedures. The hotel's ownership group decided to implement new registration procedures in 1975, requiring photo identification and credit card authorization for all guests. However, the JFCS Morrison registrations continued to appear monthly, complete with identification numbers and credit card information that corresponded to no actual accounts. The signature remained identical to previous entries, unaffected by the new requirements. Federal investigators briefly examined the case in 1976 after the credit card fraud implications were reported to appropriate authorities. However, their investigation found no evidence of criminal activity, as no actual financial institutions were involved, and no losses had been incurred by legitimate cardholders. The case was classified as a civil matter and returned to local authorities. The J. Morrison registration ceased abruptly in January 1977, ending more than 5 years of monthly appearances without explanation. Hotel staff noted the absence, but made no official inquiries about why the pattern had stopped. Management expressed relief that the peculiar situation had resolved itself without requiring further investigation or policy changes. The Wendover Nugget Hotel changed ownership in 1978 and underwent renovation that included computerized registration systems and modern security equipment. Guest registers from the 1970s were archived in the hotel's storage facility, where they remain available for inspection by researchers or legal authorities. The 72 J. Morrison entries are clearly visible in identical handwriting, a consistent anomaly in an otherwise normal record of hotel operations. Current hotel management reports no unusual registration patterns or unexplained guest activities. The property operates as a standard budget accommodation serving travelers crossing the Nevada-Utah border, with no indication of the systematic mystery that occurred throughout the 1970s. New staff members have no knowledge of the J. Morrison phenomenon, and longtime employees who remember those years prefer not to discuss the incidents. However, archival research conducted in 2015 revealed that similar signature patterns had appeared sporadically in hotel registers throughout the American West during the same time period. Guest registers from establishments in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming contain entries for J. Morrison with identical handwriting and the same unassigned Denver phone number. These registrations appear to have occurred simultaneously with the Wendover entries, suggesting that the same signature was being recorded in multiple locations on the same dates. The pattern suggests either a coordinated effort involving multiple individuals with identical handwriting or a phenomenon that transcended normal understanding of how names get written in hotel registers. The signatures continue to exist in archived documents, preserved as evidence of someone who consistently checked into hotels throughout the Mountain West for 6 years without ever being seen, remembered, or documented by any witness, surveillance system, or investigation, leaving only the careful repetition of a name that may never have belonged to anyone at all.
Navigation fails when the destination exists only in the memory of metal and magnetism. Arches National Park preserves more than 2,000 natural stone arches scattered across 76,000 acres of red sandstone desert in southeastern Utah. The park's most famous formation, Delicate Arch, stands alone on a smooth sandstone slope like a massive stone gateway framing the distant La Salle Mountains. Formed over millions of years by wind and water erosion of Entrada sandstone, deposited during the Jurassic period, the arch has become an iconic symbol of Utah's canyon country and attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually to witness its improbable balance against the desert sky. The area surrounding Delicate Arch was first systematically surveyed in the early 1900s as part of territorial mapping efforts preceding Utah's statehood. However, detailed geological surveys began only in the 1960s when the National Park Service commissioned comprehensive studies to support visitor infrastructure development and resource management planning. These surveys required precise positioning of reference markers throughout the park to establish baseline coordinates for future research and construction projects. The geological markers installed during this period consisted of bronze discs mounted on concrete pillars, each containing a detailed compass rose designed to provide accurate directional reference for surveyors and researchers. The compass roses were manufactured to exacting specifications, with magnetic needles calibrated to point toward magnetic north as determined by the National Bureau of Standards. These instruments were considered reliable enough to serve as permanent navigation references for decades of future scientific work. The anomalous marker was installed on October 14, 1973, by a U.S. Geological Survey team led by surveyor Robert Chen. The marker was positioned approximately 300 yards southeast of Delicate Arch at coordinates that provided optimal sightlines to other reference points throughout the park. Chen's installation report noted that the compass rose functioned normally during the placement process, with its needle aligning properly with magnetic north as verified by independent compass readings. However, when Park Ranger Dennis Walsh conducted a routine inspection of newly installed survey markers on November 8, 1973, he discovered that the compass needle was pointing in an unexpected direction. According to Walsh's field report, the needle indicated a bearing of 147 degrees southeast, approximately 30 degrees off from the magnetic north reading shown by his handheld compass. The needle was pointing towards something, but not toward magnetic north. Walsh wrote in his November 9th report to Chief Ranger Margaret Morrison, "I checked it against 2 different compasses and a GPS unit, and they all showed magnetic north in a completely different direction." The survey marker's compass was pointing steadily southeast, toward an area that showed nothing but empty desert on our topographic maps. Walsh's investigation revealed that the compass needle's direction corresponded to a point approximately 40 miles southeast of Delicate Arch, in an area of uninhabited desert that lay outside park boundaries. Topographic maps showed the indicated location as typical high desert terrain with no distinctive geographical features, settlements, or known landmarks that might explain the compass needle's orientation. The U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a technical team to examine the marker in December 1973, suspecting either equipment malfunction or installation error. Surveyor Patricia Santos led the inspection, bringing calibrated instruments to test the compass rose's accuracy and magnetic field measurements to determine potential sources of interference. Her report documented that the compass needle consistently pointed to the same southeast bearing, despite normal magnetic field readings throughout the area. The compass rose appears to be functioning correctly in all respects except directional accuracy, Santos wrote in her technical analysis. The needle moves freely, responds to external magnetic influences when tested, and returns to the same southeast bearing when left undisturbed. However, this bearing does not correspond to magnetic north, true north, or any identifiable navigational reference point. Santos's team conducted extensive testing for potential sources of magnetic interference, including mineral deposits, buried metal objects, and electrical installations. Their survey found normal geological conditions throughout the area, with no metallic anomalies or electromagnetic fields that might affect compass behavior. The sandstone bedrock showed typical iron oxide content consistent with the region's red coloration, but nothing that would explain the compass needle's persistent southeast orientation. The phenomenon attracted attention from Dr. Michael Webb, a geophysicist from the University of Utah who specialized in magnetic field anomalies and navigational instrument behavior. Webb visited Arches National Park in March 1974 to conduct independent measurements of the compass marker and investigate potential explanations for its unusual directional indication. "I've studied compass anomalies throughout the western United States, and this case presents unique characteristics," Webb noted in his preliminary report. "The needle's consistency is remarkable at points to the same bearing regardless of time of day, weather conditions, or seasonal variations. Most magnetic anomalies show some fluctuation, but this compass has maintained the same direction for months. Webb's investigation included attempts to identify the specific location indicated by the compass needle's bearing. Using triangulation equipment and topographic analysis, he calculated that the needle pointed toward coordinates in the remote desert southeast of Moab, in an area accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles and hiking. Webb organized an expedition to the indicated location in April 1974, hoping to discover what geographic or geological feature might explain the compass's behavior. The expedition found nothing unusual at the coordinates indicated by the compass needle. The location consisted of typical high desert terrain with scattered sagebrush, juniper trees, and exposed sandstone outcroppings. Geological surveys revealed standard rock formations and mineral composition consistent with the surrounding region. No unusual magnetic readings, buried objects, or distinctive landmarks were discovered that might explain why a compass 40 miles away would consistently point toward this unremarkable spot. We conducted a thorough search of the area indicated by the compass bearing. Webb reported, ground-penetrating radar, magnetic field measurements, geological sampling, and visual inspection revealed nothing that would distinguish this location from thousands of similar sites throughout the region. Yet the compass continues to point here with unwavering accuracy. Park rangers began monitoring the compass marker monthly, documenting its bearing and noting any changes in the needle's direction. Their logs show remarkable consistency over the following years, with the needle maintaining its southeast bearing within a margin of 2 degrees despite seasonal temperature variations, severe weather events, and minor seismic activity in the region. Ranger Thomas Morrison, who supervised the monitoring program from 1975 to 1981, noted that the compass needle's behavior seemed to reflect an underlying certainty about its target that transcended normal magnetic influences. "It's like the compass knows something we don't," Morrison observed in his 1979 annual report. Every other navigational instrument in the park works normally, but this one compass has found its own magnetic north somewhere out in the desert. The National Park Service requested assistance from the National Bureau of Standards in 1976, hoping that federal metrology experts might explain the compass anomaly. A team of specialists examined the marker and conducted precision measurements of its magnetic properties, comparing the instrument's behavior to identical compass roses installed at other locations throughout the western United States. The Bureau's report, classified upon completion, acknowledged that the compass marker exhibited non-standard directional behavior but provided no explanation for the phenomenon. According to leaked excerpts obtained years later, the investigation confirmed that the compass was mechanically sound and properly calibrated, yet consistently indicated a bearing that corresponded to no known magnetic or geographical reference point. Several attempts were made during the 1980s to replace the anomalous compass rose with new equipment, but each replacement instrument developed the same southeast bearing within weeks of installation. 3 different compass roses, manufactured by different companies and calibrated by independent laboratories, all began pointing toward the same unmarked location in the desert southeast of Delicate Arch. "We replaced that compass 4 times between 1981 and 1985, recalled maintenance supervisor Linda Patterson. Each time, the new instrument would work normally for a few weeks, then gradually shift to point southeast like all the others. By 1986, we stopped trying to fix it and just accepted that our survey marker had its own idea about which direction was important. The compass marker was removed entirely in 1987 during a park infrastructure upgrade that replaced older survey equipment with GPS-based positioning systems. However, park records indicate that the bronze compass rose was preserved in storage rather than discarded, suggesting that officials considered the anomalous instrument worthy of retention for future study. Researchers attempting to locate the stored compass rose have been unsuccessful, with park officials stating that storage records from the 1980s are incomplete and that the instrument's current whereabouts are unknown. Freedom of Information Act requests for documentation related to the compass anomaly have yielded heavily redacted responses that confirm the phenomenon was investigated but provide no details about findings or conclusions. Dr. Webb continued studying magnetic anomalies until his retirement in 1994, but his requests for access to the Arch's compass data were consistently denied. His published papers make oblique references to directional instrument anomalies in the Colorado Plateau region, but provide no specific details about the delicate arch marker or its unusual behavior. Today, visitors to Delicate Arch find no survey markers or navigational instruments near the famous sandstone formation. The concrete foundation where the anomalous compass once stood was removed and the area restored to natural conditions, leaving no trace of the 50-year period when an instrument designed to point toward magnetic north instead chose to indicate a direction toward nowhere, guided by an invisible certainty that survives only in archived reports, and the fading memories of park rangers who witnessed metal and magnetism collaborate to preserve the coordinates of a place that exists on no map, but apparently deserves to be remembered by at least one compass that knew exactly where it was and why that knowledge mattered more than magnetic north. Some forests remember how to be silent in ways that predate the invention of sound. Fish Lake National Forest sprawls across 1.4 million acres of central Utah, encompassing alpine meadows, dense aspen groves, and coniferous forests that stretch from the Wasatch Plateau to the Tushar Mountains. Named for Fish Lake, a natural alpine lake that serves as the forest's centerpiece, the region has been continuously forested for thousands of years, supporting ecosystems that range from high desert scrubland to subalpine fir forests near the peaks. The Forest Service has managed the area since 1908, maintaining a grid system that divides the vast woodland into numbered sections for administrative and firefighting purposes. Section 12 lies in the forest's southeastern quadrant, a 1 square mile area of mixed coniferous woodland situated at approximately 8,000 feet elevation. The section's boundaries were established in 1923 during a comprehensive surveying project that mapped the entire forest for timber management and recreational development. Topographically, Section 12 appears unremarkable, featuring gentle slopes covered with mature Engelmann spruce, Douglas fir, and scattered aspen groves typical of the region's montane forest ecosystem. The area's ecological composition matches surrounding sections in virtually every measurable aspect. Soil analysis reveals the same mineral content and organic matter found throughout the forest. Tree species, age distribution, and growth patterns show no significant variation from adjacent areas. Seasonal snowpack, drainage patterns, and sun exposure all fall within normal ranges for the elevation and geographic position. By every conventional measurement, Section 12 represents a standard example of healthy montane forest ecosystem. The acoustic anomaly was first documented on June 23, 1978. When Forest Ranger Robert Chen conducted a routine patrol through Section 12 as part of his assigned fire prevention rounds. Chen's incident report, filed the following day, described an immediate and complete absence of ambient forest sounds upon entering the section's boundaries. According to his notes, the silence was so profound that he initially suspected hearing damage or equipment malfunction. I entered Section 12 from the northern boundary at approximately 10:15 a.m. Chen wrote in his report to District Ranger Margaret Walsh. Within 10 steps of crossing the section line, all ambient sound ceased completely. No wind through trees, no bird calls, no insect noise, nothing. I could hear my own breathing and heartbeat, but the forest itself was absolutely silent. I've worked in these woods for 15 years, and I've never experienced anything like it. Chen's report noted that the silence affected not only natural sounds but also the acoustic properties of sounds he generated within the section. His footsteps on fallen leaves produced no audible sound, though he could feel the crunch beneath his boots. Snapping twigs resulted in complete silence despite the obvious physical breaking of the wood. Most disturbing, his attempts to call out or whistle produced no sound, though he could feel the vibrations in his throat and chest. The silence ended abruptly when Chen crossed back over Section 12's boundary into adjacent woodland. Normal forest sounds resumed immediately, with bird calls, wind through branches, and the typical acoustic environment of healthy montane forest. Chen repeated the test several times, consistently experiencing complete sound cessation within Section 12 and normal acoustic conditions outside its boundaries. Walsh assigned additional rangers to verify Chen's observations over the following weeks. Ranger Dennis Patterson's July 5th report confirmed the acoustic anomaly and provided additional details about its specific characteristics. Patterson noted that the silence appeared to have definite geographic boundaries that corresponded precisely to the section's surveyed borders, with normal sound conditions resuming within feet of crossing the boundary lines. "The transition is instantaneous and complete," Patterson wrote. "You can stand with 1 foot inside Section 12 and 1 foot outside, and only hear sounds from the foot that's outside the boundary. It's like the section exists in a bubble where sound waves simply don't function normally." Forest Service administrators initially suspected measurement error or unusual atmospheric conditions that might explain the acoustic phenomenon. However, repeated observations by multiple rangers throughout the summer of 1978 confirmed the persistence and consistency of the silence. The anomaly appeared to operate independently of weather conditions, time of day, or seasonal variations that typically influence forest acoustics. Dr. Patricia Santos, an acoustics specialist from Utah State University, visited Section 12 in August 1978 to investigate the phenomenon using scientific instruments. Santos brought sound measurement equipment, recording devices, and acoustic analysis tools designed to document and explain unusual auditory environments. Her preliminary findings, documented in a report to the Forest Service, confirmed the complete absence of measurable sound within Section 12's boundaries. Standard acoustic measurement equipment detects no sound waves within the designated area, Santos wrote in her initial analysis. This includes both ambient environmental sounds and artificially generated sounds produced by our equipment. Sound waves appear to be absorbed or canceled immediately upon generation, creating a zone of complete acoustic isolation. Santos's investigation revealed that the acoustic anomaly extended vertically as well as horizontally, affecting sound propagation at various elevations within Section 12. She used elevated platforms and climbing equipment to test sound generation and detection at different heights above the forest floor. Finding that the silence persisted consistently from ground level to the forest canopy, approximately 60 feet overhead. Radio communication testing conducted by Forest Service technicians in September 1978 revealed additional aspects of the acoustic anomaly. Rangers entering Section 12 could receive radio transmissions normally, hearing communications from colleagues outside the section's boundaries. However, they could not transmit from within the section, with their radio signals failing to reach receivers positioned just outside the boundary lines. "We could hear everything being broadcast from outside the section," reported radio technician Thomas Morrison. But when rangers inside Section 12 tried to respond, their transmissions were completely blocked. The radios showed normal power levels and signal strength indicators, but no communication got through to the outside. Wildlife monitoring conducted throughout the late 1970s documented a complete absence of animal life within Section 12. Motion-activated cameras installed throughout the section recorded no wildlife activity, despite normal animal populations in adjacent areas. Bird migration patterns appeared to route around the section, with species that normally occupied similar forest habitats showing consistent avoidance of the area. "It's like the animals know something we don't," observed wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Webb, who studied the section's ecological patterns in 1979. Every species that should be present in this type of forest habitat is completely absent from Section 12. Not just reduced populations, but complete avoidance. The ecological data suggests that animal behavior is responding to environmental conditions that our instruments can't detect. The U.S. Forest Service commissioned a comprehensive study of Section 12 in 1980, bringing together specialists in acoustics, ecology, geology, and atmospheric science to investigate the phenomenon systematically. The research team, led by Dr. Richard Webb from Colorado State University, spent 6 months conducting intensive measurements and analysis of the section's unique properties. Webb's team confirmed all previous observations regarding the acoustic anomaly while documenting additional unusual characteristics. Air pressure measurements within Section 12 showed subtle but consistent variations from surrounding areas, though the differences were too small to explain the complete absence of sound. Electromagnetic field readings revealed minor anomalies that suggested possible interference with normal acoustic propagation, but no definitive causal relationship could be established. Our investigation documented significant deviations from normal environmental conditions within Section 12, Webb wrote in his preliminary report. However, the specific mechanisms responsible for the acoustic anomaly remain unexplained. The phenomenon appears to represent a localized suspension of normal physical laws governing sound propagation, but we can identify no natural or artificial cause for this suspension. The research team's final report was classified immediately upon completion in January 1981. Forest Service officials stated that the classification was necessary to prevent public safety issues that might arise from increased visitor traffic to the area. However, leaked portions of the report obtained years later suggested that the investigation had reached conclusions that federal agencies considered sensitive or potentially alarming. According to the leaked excerpts, Webb's team had documented progressive expansion of the acoustic anomaly beyond Section 12's original boundaries. Measurements conducted in late 1980 showed that the silent zone had grown by approximately 50 yards in all directions, encompassing areas that had previously exhibited normal sound propagation. The report recommended immediate and comprehensive monitoring to track further expansion of the phenomenon. However, all research activities in Section 12 were suspended in February 1981 without public explanation. The monitoring equipment was removed, and access to the area was restricted to essential Forest Service personnel only. Rangers assigned to patrol the section reported that the acoustic anomaly persisted, but were instructed not to discuss their observations with researchers, media, or the general public. Dr. Webb attempted to continue his research independently, but was denied access to Section 12 and informed that his federal research permits had been revoked. His subsequent academic career suffered after his continued advocacy for investigation of the acoustic phenomenon, and he accepted early retirement in 1985 without completing his planned research. Current Forest Service maps show Section 12 as a standard administrative division, with no special designations or access restrictions. However, the area remains effectively closed to public access due to its location in remote backcountry that requires extensive hiking to reach. Rangers who patrol the region report that the acoustic anomaly persists, but decline to provide specific details about current conditions within the section. Satellite imagery from recent years shows Section 12 as an apparently normal forest area with no visible distinction from surrounding woodland. However, wildlife tracking data suggests that animal avoidance of the area continues, with GPS collar studies showing that elk, deer, and other large mammals consistently route around the section's boundaries despite abundant food sources and suitable habitat within the silent zone. Local hiking guides familiar with the remote areas of Fish Lake National Forest occasionally report encounters with unusually quiet woodland areas that match descriptions of Section 12. These reports typically describe brief experiences of complete acoustic isolation followed by rapid return to normal forest sounds, suggesting that the phenomenon may affect visitors who unknowingly cross the section's unmarked boundaries. The silence persists in Section 12, encompassing 1 square mile of forest where sound waves surrender to an unknown force that transforms normal woodland into a void where footsteps fall without sound and voices speak into emptiness. Rangers continue their patrols through the acoustic anomaly, walking in perfect silence among trees that remember how to be quiet in ways that predate the arrival of sound in the forest, their radios receiving messages from a world of noise that grows more distant with each silent step deeper into the woods where nothing has spoken aloud for more than 40 years. History leaves tracks in places where speed becomes memory. The Bonneville Salt Flats stretch across 30,000 acres of northwestern Utah, a perfectly flat expanse of crystallized salt left behind by ancient Lake Bonneville that once covered much of the Great Basin. The flats extend beyond the horizon in every direction, creating a white desert so level that the curvature of the earth becomes visible at its edges. This natural speedway has drawn racers since the early 1900s, when the combination of flat terrain and hard-packed salt surface provided ideal conditions for attempting land speed records that pushed the boundaries of automotive and human achievement. The area's reputation as a racing venue began in 1914 when Teddy Tetzlaff drove his Blitzen-Benz across the salt at over 100 miles per hour, establishing the flats as a proving ground for speed. By the 1930s, the location had become synonymous with land speed racing, attracting drivers and engineers from around the world who sought to break barriers that seemed impossible just years earlier. The isolation and vast open space allowed for the long acceleration distances required for record attempts, while the salt surface provided consistent traction despite its crystalline composition. Racing season typically occurred during late summer and early autumn when seasonal flooding had receded and the salt had dried to optimal hardness. Drivers would arrive with specially built vehicles designed for maximum velocity, setting up timing equipment and support crews for attempts that required precise coordination and split-second measurements. Successful record runs were documented meticulously, with official timekeepers recording not only speeds but also exact routes, timing intervals, and geographic coordinates that defined each achievement. The Phantom Lights were first documented on September 5, 1951, exactly 1 year after John Cobb's fatal crash while attempting to break his own water speed record on nearby Pyramid Lake. Bureau of Land Management caretaker Robert Chen was conducting routine maintenance on racing facilities when he observed moving lights crossing the salt flats along what appeared to be established racing lines. According to Chen's incident report, the lights traced a precise path from south to north across the flats, maintaining consistent speed and direction for approximately 2 minutes before disappearing. The lights moved like a vehicle traveling at high speed, but there was no sound and no physical object visible. Chen wrote in his September 6th report to District Supervisor Margaret Walsh. They followed exactly the same route that John Cobb had used for his record attempts, starting from the southern timing station and ending at the northern marker. The lights appeared at 8:47 p.m., which was exactly 24 hours after Cobb had made his final successful run the previous year. Chen's initial report was dismissed as possibly resulting from distant vehicle headlights or atmospheric phenomena common in desert environments. However, additional sightings occurred throughout the autumn of 1951, always corresponding to historical anniversary dates of significant land speed record attempts. The lights appeared to follow precise routes used by famous drivers, maintaining speeds consistent with the original record runs and disappearing at the exact geographic coordinates where the historical attempts had concluded. Local racing enthusiasts became aware of the phenomenon during the 1952 racing season, when several drivers and crew members reported seeing unexplained lights during evening hours following race days. Driver Dennis Patterson documented multiple sightings in his racing journal, noting that the lights always appeared on anniversary dates and followed historically significant racing lines across the salt flats. We started paying attention to the dates and realized the lights were following a calendar, Patterson wrote in his 1953 season summary. Every time a major record had been set in previous years, we'd see lights retracing the exact same path on the anniversary. They'd start at the same time, follow the same route, and run for exactly the same duration as the original record attempt. The phenomenon attracted attention from officials with the Southern California Timing Association, the organization responsible for sanctioning land speed record attempts at Bonneville. Timing official Patricia Santos began documenting the light sightings systematically, correlating observations with historical racing records to verify the accuracy of the apparent recreations. Her analysis revealed an unsettling level of precision in the phantom light's behavior. The correlation between the lights and historical racing data is extraordinary, Santos noted in her 1954 report to the association. The lights appear at the exact anniversary times, follow the precise racing lines documented in our records, and maintain speeds that match the historical record attempts. They even reproduce the timing intervals recorded during the original runs, as if someone were playing back the events with perfect accuracy. Santos's investigation documented more than 30 separate incidents between 1952 and 1955, each corresponding to a documented land speed record attempt from previous decades. The lights appeared most frequently during the late summer and early autumn months that coincided with traditional racing season, though some winter sightings corresponded to off-season record attempts made during favorable weather conditions. Dr. Michael Webb, a physicist from the University of Utah who studied atmospheric phenomena in desert environments, visited Bonneville in September 1955 to investigate the light sightings. Webb brought photographic equipment and electromagnetic detection instruments designed to document and analyze unexplained luminous phenomena. His observations confirmed the existence of the lights while raising additional questions about their nature and origin. The lights are definitely visible and appear to move along consistent paths, Webb noted in his preliminary report. However, they don't register on electromagnetic detection equipment and don't appear clearly in photographs despite being visible to the naked eye. They seem to exist in a spectrum or dimension that standard scientific instruments can't adequately capture. Webb's investigation revealed that the lights appeared only during specific atmospheric conditions that occurred most frequently on anniversary dates. Clear, dry evenings with minimal wind seemed to provide optimal conditions for the phenomenon, while overcast or stormy weather prevented the lights from manifesting. Most significantly, the lights appeared to respond to the original timing mechanisms, appearing precisely when historical record runs had been initiated and disappearing when the original attempts had concluded. Salt flat racing veterans who had participated in historical record attempts expressed varying degrees of unease about the phantom recreations of their achievements. Driver Thomas Morrison, who had set multiple records during the 1940s, stated that observing the lights was like watching ghosts of his own past performances replay endlessly across the salt. It's disturbing to see your own racing lines being traced by lights that shouldn't exist, Morrison told investigators in 1956. The lights follow exactly the same path I took during my record runs, maintaining the same speed and timing intervals. It's like the salt flats have memorized every record attempt and are playing them back for reasons nobody understands. The phenomenon reached peak intensity during the late 1950s, when increasing numbers of observers reported seeing multiple sets of lights simultaneously recreating different historical record attempts. On September 15, 1958, more than a dozen witnesses observed what appeared to be a comprehensive replay of major land speed records from the previous 3 decades, with different colored lights tracing various racing lines across the flats in chronological sequence. Bureau of Land Management officials began investigating the phenomenon more seriously in 1959, concerned about potential impacts on current racing activities and public safety. However, their investigation was complicated by the light's unpredictable appearance schedule and their resistance to conventional detection methods. Standard surveillance equipment failed to capture clear evidence of the phenomenon, though multiple witnesses continued to report consistent observations. The U.S. Air Force briefly investigated the light sightings in 1960, focusing on the possibility that the phenomena might represent atmospheric testing or experimental aircraft operations. However, their investigation found no correlation between the lights and any military activities in the region. The timing precision and historical correlation of the sightings suggested civilian rather than military origins, though no civilian explanation could account for the phenomenon's characteristics. Federal interest in the Bonneville Lights waned during the 1960s, coinciding with decreased land speed racing activity and reduced media attention to the Salt Flats. However, local observers continued documenting anniversary appearances of the Phantom Lights, maintaining records that showed consistent correlation between sightings and historical racing achievements. The phenomenon persisted despite changing ownership of racing facilities and modifications to the Salt Flat environment. Racing activity at Bonneville declined significantly during the 1970s and 80s due to environmental concerns and competition from other venues. However, the Phantom Lights continued appearing on anniversary dates, suggesting that the phenomenon operated independently of current racing activity. Observers noted that the lights recreated historical record attempts regardless of whether contemporary racing was occurring at the Salt Flats. Current land speed racing at Bonneville operates under strict environmental protocols that limit the season duration and require extensive restoration of disturbed areas. However, racing enthusiasts and Salt Flat historians continue to report anniversary appearances of the Phantom Lights, maintaining informal documentation of sightings that span more than 70 years of observations. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a historian studying the cultural impact of land speed racing, has collected more than 200 witness accounts of the Bonneville Lights spanning from 1951 to the present day. Her research confirms the consistency of the phenomenon while documenting subtle changes in the light's behavior that correspond to modifications in the Salt Flat environment and racing infrastructure. The lights appear to adapt to changes in the physical environment while maintaining their historical accuracy, Morrison noted in her 2015 study. When racing courses are modified or timing equipment is relocated, the lights adjust their paths accordingly, as if they're updating their recreations to reflect current conditions while preserving the essential characteristics of the original record attempts. Today, visitors to the Bonneville Salt Flats during anniversary periods occasionally report seeing distant lights moving across the white expanse during evening hours. These sightings are typically attributed to vehicle traffic on nearby Interstate 80 or atmospheric effects common in desert environments. However, careful observers who know the dates and routes of historical land speed records sometimes recognize the precise timing and geographic accuracy that distinguishes the Phantom Lights from conventional explanations. The lights continue their annual recreations across the Salt Flats, tracing the paths of drivers who pushed against the limits of speed and technology in pursuit of records that have become permanent fixtures in the timeline of human achievement. Each anniversary brings another performance of automotive history written in light across the crystallized remains of an ancient lake, where the past maintains its own speed records in a dimension that exists parallel to the present but operates according to schedules that only the salt remembers and only the lights can read. Time, it seems, sometimes delivers its messages before they are written. Bluff sits on the San Juan River in southeastern Utah, a small town of 300 residents surrounded by Red Rock Desert and the towering sandstone formations that define the Colorado Plateau. Established in 1880 by Mormon pioneers seeking refuge from federal anti-polygamy laws, Bluff has remained isolated by geography and intention. Connected to the outside world by a single highway, that winds through canyon country where cell phone signals fail and the nearest city lies more than 60 miles away across challenging terrain. The town's remoteness has shaped its character throughout its history. Mail delivery to Bluff has always been irregular due to weather conditions, flash floods, and the difficulty of maintaining road access across desert washes that can become impassable during storms. The post office, established in 1881, serves as a crucial communication link for residents who depend on postal service for everything from medication deliveries to family correspondence. Given the area's isolation, residents have developed a deep appreciation for reliable mail service and pay close attention to postal patterns and delivery schedules. The San Juan River provides Bluff's primary geographic reference point, flowing east toward its confluence with the Colorado River through a landscape that has changed little since the first European explorations of the region in the 1870s. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous human habitation for more than 1,000 years, with ancestral Puebloan ruins scattered throughout the surrounding canyon systems. The Navajo Nation borders the town to the south, and traditional cultural connections remain strong despite the political boundaries that separate contemporary communities. The anomalous mail began appearing on October 15, 1979, when Postmaster Janet Morrison discovered 3 letters in the morning delivery that had been postmarked in Bluff, but bore return addresses for locations within the town that did not exist. The letters were addressed to real residents and had been processed through normal postal channels, complete with proper stamps and routing marks that indicated they had originated locally and been processed at the Bluff post office. The letters looked completely normal except for the return addresses. Morrison wrote in her incident report dated October 16th, "They were postmarked with our Bluff zip code and processing stamp, but the return addresses listed street names and house numbers that don't exist in our town. I checked our address records going back to 1881, and these locations have never been part of Bluff's postal system." The 3 letters contained information about upcoming local events that had not yet been announced or planned. One letter reminded the recipient about a school board meeting scheduled for October 22nd to discuss budget issues, though no such meeting had been called at the time the letter was received. Another letter thanked a resident for their participation in a community fundraiser planned for November, though no fundraising event had been organized. The 3rd letter provided details about a road closure due to bridge repairs that were not scheduled to begin until the following month. Morrison contacted the recipients to verify the letter's contents and discovered that none of them recognized the return addresses or understood how they had received mail describing events that had not yet occurred. However, within days of receiving the letters, each of the predicted events was announced by local authorities, with details matching exactly what had been described in the mysterious correspondence. The school board meeting was called on October 20th, 2 days after Mrs. Patterson received the letter reminding her about it, Morrison noted in her follow-up report. The agenda items and meeting time matched exactly what was written in the letter she'd received 8 days earlier. The same pattern occurred with the other letter 7s were announced that matched the descriptions in mail people had already received. Additional letters began appearing regularly throughout the autumn of 1979, always postmarked from Bluff, but bearing return addresses that corresponded to no known locations within the town. The frequency increased to approximately 1 letter per week by December, with different residents receiving mail that described upcoming events, weather conditions, and community developments with consistent accuracy. The letters appeared to be typed on standard paper using conventional envelopes and postage, but they invariably contained information that would not become publicly known until days or weeks after the letters were received. Local residents initially suspected that someone with advanced knowledge of community plans was sending anonymous letters as a form of practical joke or social commentary. However, investigation revealed that many of the predicted events were decided spontaneously by individuals who had no advance warning that their decisions would be discussed in letters received days earlier. The phenomenon appeared to involve genuine precognitive information rather than insider knowledge of planned activities. Town Council member Robert Chen documented several incidents where letters accurately predicted decisions he made independently, including his vote on zoning issues and his schedule for public meetings. I received a letter thanking me for supporting the Henderson property rezoning application 3 days before the application was even submitted. Chen wrote in his personal notes from January 1980. When the application was filed, I found myself voting exactly as the letter had predicted, though I hadn't made up my mind about the issue when I received the mail. The letters consistently originated from return addresses that followed proper formatting for bluff addresses but listed street names and house numbers that had never existed in the town's postal system. Research conducted by Morrison revealed that some of the fictional addresses corresponded to areas that had been considered for development in previous decades but were never built upon. Others referenced street names that appeared in early territorial surveys but were never implemented when the town was formally platted. Dr. Patricia Santos, a postal system specialist from the University of Utah, visited Bluff in March 1980 to investigate the phenomenon at Morrison's request. Santos examined the letters and postal processing equipment, attempting to determine how mail could be processed through official channels despite originating from non-existent addresses. Her analysis confirmed that the letters had been handled by standard postal procedures but could identify no source for their origin. The letters show all the characteristics of mail that has been properly processed through the postal system. Santos wrote in her preliminary report, "Postmarks, routing stamps, and handling marks all indicate normal processing procedures. However, the return addresses don't correspond to any existing locations, and there's no record of the letters being deposited at the post office by any identifiable individual." Santos's investigation revealed that the letters appeared in the postal system during overnight hours when the post office was closed and unstaffed. Security measures at the Bluff post office were minimal, but the building was locked each evening and showed no signs of unauthorized entry. The letters appeared among regular mail deliveries as if they had been processed through normal channels, though no postal worker remembered handling them and no record existed of their deposit or initial processing. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service launched a formal investigation in June 1980, after Morrison filed official reports documenting more than 40 incidents of anomalous mail delivery. Postal Inspector Michael Webb was assigned to the case and conducted extensive interviews with Bluff residents while examining postal procedures and security protocols. Webb's investigation confirmed the existence of the phenomenon, but failed to identify its source or mechanism. The letters appear to originate within the postal system itself, rather than being deposited by external sources, Webb noted in his interim report. They show proper processing marks and handling characteristics, but there's no documentation of how they entered the system. It's as if the Postal Service is generating mail independently without human intervention. Webb's investigation expanded to include examination of postal processing equipment and computer systems that might explain the automatic generation of letters. However, the Bluff Post Office operated with minimal automation, relying primarily on manual processing methods that would not support systematic mail generation. The letters appeared to be individually typed and addressed rather than produced by automated systems, though no typewriter or addressing equipment at the post office matched the formatting used in the anomalous correspondence. Federal investigators became involved in the case during the summer of 1980, when the Postal Inspection Service requested assistance from other agencies in explaining the phenomenon. However, the nature of this federal involvement was never disclosed publicly, and Webb's investigation was abruptly terminated in September 1980 without explanation. Webb was reassigned to a different district, and his case files were classified under federal security provisions. I was told that the investigation had been transferred to a different agency with specialized expertise in unusual postal phenomena, Webb stated in a brief interview conducted years later. I was instructed to surrender all documentation related to the Bluff case and not to discuss my findings with anyone. The classification level suggested that the case had national security implications, though I couldn't understand why letters predicting local events would be considered a security matter. The anomalous male continued appearing throughout 1980 and into early 1981, with residents receiving a total of more than 100 letters that accurately predicted local events. However, the frequency began declining in February 1981, and the last documented letter was received on April 18, 1981. The 18-month phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun, with no explanation for either its onset or cessation. Morrison attempted to maintain records of the incident for Postal Service archives, but she was informed in May 1981 that all documentation related to the anomalous male was to be forwarded to federal authorities and removed from local files. The letters themselves were collected by unidentified officials who claimed to represent the Postal Inspection Service, though they provided no credentials or explanation for the confiscation. Current Postal Service operations in Bluff follow standard procedures with no unusual phenomena reported since 1981. New postal employees have no knowledge of the previous incidents, and longtime residents rarely discuss the period when their mail arrived before the events it described had occurred. Morrison retired from Postal Service in 1985 and declined to provide detailed interviews about her experiences with the anomalous male. However, occasional reports surface of similar incidents in other isolated communities throughout the American West, involving letters that arrive before their contents become relevant, and postmarks that originate from addresses that exist only in the careful geometry of postal codes and the persistent memory of a system that sometimes remembers to deliver information before anyone has written it down. The letters continue to arrive in the space between what has been mailed and what has been received, carrying news from a future that understands the precise timing required to ensure that information reaches its destination exactly when it needs to be read, regardless of when it was written or by whom. Stone remembers how to grow in directions that geology forgot to explain. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area encompasses 1.2 million acres of red rock desert surrounding Lake Powell, where the Colorado River was dammed in 1963 to create the second-largest artificial reservoir in the United States. The area preserves some of the most spectacular sandstone formations in the American Southwest, including slot canyons, natural arches, and towering buttes carved by millions of years of wind and water erosion. Before the dam's construction, Glen Canyon was considered one of the most beautiful river corridors in North America, with ancient Anasazi ruins and pristine wilderness areas that are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of reservoir water. The region's geological foundation consists primarily of Navajo sandstone deposited during the Jurassic period, when vast sand dunes covered much of the western United States. This formation, characterized by its distinctive cross-bedded layers and iron oxide staining that creates the area's famous red coloration, typically erodes at predictable rates when exposed to wind, water, and temperature fluctuations. Normal weathering processes cause the sandstone to shed material gradually, creating the spectacular slot canyons and sculptural formations that attract millions of visitors annually to witness the ongoing dance between stone and the elements that shape it. Archaeological evidence throughout Glen Canyon indicates continuous human presence for more than 2,000 years, with ancestral Puebloan peoples leaving extensive rock art panels, dwelling sites, and granaries in protected alcoves throughout the canyon system. The petroglyphs and pictographs found in the region represent some of the most sophisticated rock art traditions in North America, featuring complex geometric patterns, anthropomorphic figures, and symbolic designs whose meanings remain largely unknown to contemporary researchers despite decades of study. The anomalous erosion was first documented on August 12, 1985, when National Park Service geologist Robert Chen noticed unusual changes in a rock formation near the Antelope Canyon area during routine geological monitoring. Chen was conducting annual measurements of erosion rates at established monitoring sites when he discovered that one formation was showing signs of material accumulation rather than the expected weathering and material loss typical of exposed sandstone in the high desert environment. The formation appeared to be growing rather than eroding. Chen wrote in his field report dated August 13th. Careful measurement revealed approximately 3 millimeters of new material had been added to the rock face since our previous measurement in July. The new material matched the existing sandstone in composition and appearance, but it had formed in a pattern that wasn't there before a series of curved lines that looked almost like carved symbols. Chen's discovery prompted additional investigation by Park Service researchers who specialized in geological processes and rock formation analysis. Dr. Margaret Walsh, a sedimentologist from the University of Utah, visited Glen Canyon in September 1985 to examine Chen's findings and conduct independent measurements of the formation's unusual growth patterns. Walsh's analysis confirmed that the sandstone was indeed accumulating material rather than eroding, though the mechanism responsible for this reverse weathering process remained unexplained. Standard geological processes involve the removal of material through chemical and physical weathering, Walsh noted in her preliminary report. What we're observing here represents the opposite material is being added to the rock face through some unknown process that creates new sandstone with the same mineralogical composition as the existing formation. The growth follows specific patterns that suggest organized rather than random accumulation. Walsh's investigation revealed that the material growth occurred at a consistent rate of approximately 1 millimeter per month, regardless of seasonal weather variations or environmental conditions that typically influence erosion rates. The new material appeared overnight, during periods of minimal human activity in the area, though no witnesses had observed the actual formation process. Most significantly, the growth patterns consistently replicated design elements found in ancestral Puebloan rock art throughout the region. Park Ranger Dennis Patterson began documenting the formation's changes with time-lapse photography in October 1985, establishing a monitoring protocol that would track the phenomenon's progression over extended periods. Patterson's photographic record revealed that the growing patterns followed complex geometric designs that required months to complete, as if the stone was slowly carving itself according to a predetermined template. The patterns emerged gradually, line by line, over the course of several months, Patterson noted in his November 1985 report. Each new millimeter of growth adds another segment to what eventually becomes a complete design that matches petroglyphs we've documented at other sites throughout Glen Canyon. It's like watching someone carve rock art in extremely slow motion, except no one is doing the carving. Local Navajo tribal members expressed interest in the phenomenon when shown photographs of the growing formations. Elder Thomas Morrison examined Patterson's documentation and noted the resemblance between the emerging patterns and traditional symbols found in ancestral Puebloan rock art sites. Morrison suggested that the growing formations might represent a natural process that ancestral peoples had observed and incorporated into their spiritual understanding of the landscape. The old ones knew things about the canyon that we've forgotten, Morrison told researchers in December 1985. They carved symbols on the rocks, but maybe they were also watching the rocks carve themselves. Our stories talk about living stone that grows and changes according to its own purposes. This might be what those stories were trying to preserve. Additional monitoring sites were established throughout Glen Canyon in early 1986 as researchers attempted to determine the scope and distribution of the reverse erosion phenomenon. Dr. N.I.T. Patricia Santos, a geomorphologist from Arizona State University, coordinated the expanded monitoring program, installing precision measuring equipment at 47 locations throughout the recreation area. Santos's preliminary findings suggested that the anomalous growth was occurring at multiple sites, though not all formations showed the same consistent patterns or growth rates. We've identified 12 formations that exhibit measurable material accumulation, Santos wrote in her interim report dated June 1986. The growth rates vary from less than 1 millimeter per month to more than 5 millimeters per month, depending on the formation's location and orientation. All sites show pattern development that corresponds to known rock art motifs, but each formation appears to be creating unique variations on traditional designs. Santos's research attracted attention from Dr. Michael Webb, a specialist in unusual geological phenomena from Colorado State University, who had studied similar anomalies at other locations throughout the western United States. Webb joined the Glen Canyon investigation in July 1986, bringing sophisticated analytical equipment designed to document and explain unconventional rock formation processes. The mineral composition of the new material is identical to the existing sandstone, down to trace element analysis, Webb noted in his technical report. However, the crystalline structure shows subtle differences that suggest formation under conditions that don't match current environmental parameters. It's as if the new material is being created using historical rather than contemporary geological processes. Webb's investigation revealed that the growing formations exhibited unusual magnetic properties that distinguished them from surrounding sandstone. The new material showed stronger magnetic alignment than typical Navajo sandstone, suggesting that it had formed under the influence of magnetic fields stronger than those currently present in the region. However, no source for such enhanced magnetic fields could be identified through conventional geological survey methods. The Department of the Interior launched a formal investigation into the Glen Canyon phenomenon in September 1986, citing concerns about potential impacts on park resources and visitor safety. However, the nature of this investigation was never disclosed publicly, and researchers who had been studying the formations were informed that their work was being classified for national security reasons. Access to the monitoring sites was restricted, and ongoing research was suspended pending completion of the federal investigation. We were told that our research had identified geological processes that could have significant implications for resource extraction and national economic interests, Santos recalled in a later interview. All our data, photographs, and analytical results were confiscated, and we were required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prevented us from discussing our findings. The investigation was classified at a level that suggested the phenomenon had strategic rather than purely scientific significance. The federal investigation concluded in March 1987, with all research materials remaining classified and no public report issued about the findings. The monitoring sites were dismantled, and the formations showing anomalous growth were declared off-limits to visitors due to unstable geological conditions. Researchers who had participated in the study were reassigned to different projects, and requests for information about the Glen Canyon formations were consistently denied by federal agencies. Chen continued working for the National Park Service until his retirement in 1995, but he was transferred to different assignments that kept him away from Glen Canyon. His attempts to revisit the formations during off-duty hours were prevented by security measures that effectively sealed the area from unauthorized access. Chen's personal notes and photographs from the original investigation disappeared from his office during a routine facility move in 1988. Current geological monitoring at Glen Canyon focuses on conventional erosion patterns and dam-related environmental impacts, with no reference to the reverse erosion phenomenon documented during the 1980s. Park Service materials make no mention of the growing formations, and new employees receive no training about unusual geological processes in the area. Visitors who ask about rock art formation or geological anomalies are redirected to standard interpretive materials that describe conventional weathering and erosion processes. However, tribal members and longtime area residents occasionally report observing new rock art in locations where none had previously existed. These reports are typically dismissed as misidentification of previously unknown panels or natural erosion patterns that coincidentally resemble human-made designs. The reports cluster around areas that were identified as monitoring sites during the 1980s, though current access restrictions prevent verification of these claims. Recent satellite imagery of Glen Canyon shows several formations that appear to display rock art panels not documented in historical surveys, suggesting that the reverse erosion process may continue despite the absence of official monitoring. The patterns visible in satellite images match design elements found throughout the region's ancestral Puebloan sites, though the apparent freshness of the carved lines suggests recent rather than historical origin. The formations continue their slow growth in areas where wind and water should wear stone away, adding millimeters of new sandstone each month in patterns that mirror the artistic traditions of peoples who observed these same canyons for thousands of years. The stone carves itself according to templates that exist somewhere in the space between geology and archaeology, creating art that emerges from the rock, as if the symbols had always been present and were simply waiting for the right conditions to reveal themselves to a world that understands erosion only as a process of taking away rather than a method for adding stories to stone one careful millimeter at a time.